Around the middle of the 1600s, a writer named Lucian wrote a short guide on how to write history. At the start, he says he was inspired to do this because so many people were writing about a recent Roman war with Parthia. He joked that suddenly everyone thought they were Thucydides, Herodotus, or Xenophon. He even said that the old saying, "War is the father of all things," seemed true, because the war had led to so many new historians. Although Lucian makes fun of these writers in a sharp and humorous way, his work reminds us of something important. Writing about war was a big part of Roman culture. This wasn't just because of the influence of earlier Greek historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, but also because war was such a common and powerful part of life in the Roman world. First, when we say warfare, we don't just mean fighting, like battles, sieges, or raids. We also mean everything that made war possible: the armies, the officers, the soldiers, and the systems behind them. The Roman world means more than just the lands controlled by Rome. It includes Roman society, politics, and economy. In the past, military history was often treated as something separate from these bigger topics. That means looking at how war affected not just the battlefield, but also the way people lived, worked, and ruled. Now let's talk about the word Roman. You might think it's easy to define, but it's actually more complex. Time-wise, it covers the period from when Rome first appeared as a small settlement around the 8th century BC, all the way to the early 7th century AD, when big changes came with the rise of Islam. The lands Rome controlled changed a lot during that time. At first, it was just the city and nearby areas in Italy. But over time, through war, Rome expanded to control the whole Italian peninsula, then the Western Mediterranean, then almost the entire Mediterranean and the lands around it. Later, in late Antiquity, this area started to shrink again. As Rome's power grew, so did the meaning of being Roman. At first, it meant someone from the city of Rome. But later, people from other parts of Italy, and even from distant provinces, were included. They were given Roman citizenship, and over time, Roman came to mean nearly anyone living in the empire. This became official in the early 3rd century, when almost all free people in the empire were granted Roman citizenship. Things became even more complex later on. During the final centuries of the Roman Empire, people who were once seen as outsiders, like those from barbarian tribes, began to join the Roman army. Some even rose to high positions of power. So, when we use the word Roman to describe people, we need to remember that its meaning changed over time and in different places. A person who called themselves Roman might also see themselves as something else, like a Samnite, a Gaul, an Athenian, or a Frank. Also, being Roman didn't always mean that someone spoke Latin. In the early days of Rome, Latin was expected, and knowing the language helped people be seen as more Roman. Plus, it came with useful benefits. But most people in the empire actually spoke other languages, like Greek, Celtic, or Punic. Many only knew a little Latin. One of the places where Latin was taught and used more often was the Roman army. We said earlier that Roman history begins with the founding of Rome, probably in the 8th century BC. But because we don't have good written sources for that early time, starting from the mid-4th century BC, that's when the sources become clearer, and also when Rome seriously started expanding its territory. These periods are mostly based on political changes. Scholars have debated how democratic the Republic really was and how much power the Senate had. But one thing is clear: the Republic was designed to prevent one person from having total power. That's why it stands out from what came later: the Empire, which was ruled by one man. The first emperor, Augustus, understood how people still respected the old Republic. His adopted father, Julius Caesar, had been killed partly because he acted like a king. So Augustus avoided calling himself a king or emperor. Instead, he used the title princeps, which means first citizen or leading citizen. The system that Augustus created, the one that brought political stability until the early 3rd century, is called the Principate. Late Antiquity is the name for the period from the middle of the 3rd century to the early 7th century. During this time, the Roman Empire faced serious problems. It almost broke apart in the 3rd century, and later, in the 5th century, it lost its western half. In the 7th century, the Islamic invasions brought even more big changes. The Roman Empire managed to recover from the 3rd century crisis thanks to a new kind of emperor. Unlike Augustus and the early emperors, who were usually from the noble Senate class, these new emperors came from the army. They weren't from high-status families, but they made big changes. They built up the army and created a larger government system to manage the empire. Even though Roman history is usually divided based on big political changes, these periods also match major changes in the army. We'll look at those changes more closely later, but here are the basics. In the Republic, the army was made up of citizen soldiers. People were expected to serve for up to 16 years in total, but many were let go after 6 years of continuous service. That changed when Augustus came to power. He created a professional, full-time army, and soldiers now had to serve for at least 20 years. This new system lasted into late antiquity. In the early 4th century, emperors who had military experience brought in even more changes. As a result, the Roman army in late antiquity looked quite different from the army during Augustus's time. We will explore Roman views on war and peace, as well as their belief in victory and how they dealt with losing. War was a big part of Roman history, and we give a general overview of when and where it happened. During the time of the Roman Republic, Rome grew mainly by fighting wars and expanding its land, though this didn't happen at the same speed everywhere. At the beginning of the Republic, Rome only controlled a small area in central Italy. It had to compete with other nearby Latin communities for power in the region. By the middle of the 4th century BC, Rome had become the most powerful force in western central Italy. After that, it started fighting with the Samnites and other Italic groups who lived further south. These were tough and determined enemies, but after many long wars, Rome defeated them and became the strongest state in central Italy. With that strength, Rome began expanding even more, making alliances and slowly bringing more areas under its control. In the south, the Greek city of Tarentum didn't want Rome to take over, so it asked for help from Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, a region in today's Western Balkans. Pyrrhus came to Italy with his army in 280 BC and won some battles against the Romans. But in the end, he had to leave. And by the 260s BC, Rome had full control over almost all of Italy south of the Po River. This made Rome a major power in the Western Mediterranean. It was only a matter of time before Rome clashed with another big power in the region, Carthage. Carthage started as a Phoenician colony in North Africa, and by the early 3rd century BC had grown powerful in North Africa, Spain, and Sicily. In 264 BC, Rome got involved in Sicily, which started the first of 3 wars with Carthage. These are known as the Punic Wars. These wars took a huge toll in terms of lives and resources, but were also key steps in Rome's rise. The First Punic War was mostly fought at sea. Since Carthage had a strong navy, many thought it would win easily. But Rome quickly learned how to build and use its own navy. After more than 20 years of fighting, Rome finally won a major sea battle near Sicily in 241 BC. This forced Carthage to accept harsh peace terms. But Carthage wasn't done. Angry and determined to regain power, it focused on building strength in Spain. Then, in 218 BC, the famous general Hannibal launched a bold attack by leading his army into Italy by land. He won several early battles, including a huge victory at Cannae in 216 BC. For a time, it looked like he might succeed in breaking Rome's alliances in Italy and forcing them to surrender. Some allies did leave Rome, but most stayed loyal. Thanks to its large population and resources, Rome eventually recovered and defeated Hannibal. In 201 BC, it forced Carthage to accept an even tougher peace. The third and final Punic War was short and one-sided. By 200 BC, Rome had already been fighting almost non-stop for about 150 years. Most of these wars were against strong and determined enemies, like the Samnites and Carthaginians. After defeating Hannibal, Rome became the top power in the Western Mediterranean. In the 2nd century BC, the pattern of war changed. In some areas, especially in Spain and northern Italy, Rome had to fight smaller, ongoing battles to keep control. These places were home to Celtic and Ligurian tribes, who had long been a threat. At the same time, Rome also fought some shorter wars in the eastern Mediterranean against powerful kingdoms like Macedon and the Seleucid Empire. These kingdoms were left over from Alexander the Great's empire. Even though they had strong armies and resources, they couldn't keep up with Rome in war. Rome went to war with Macedon in 200 BC, partly because Macedon's king, Philip V, had supported Hannibal. Rome defeated Philip in the early 100s BC, especially at the Battle of Cynocephali in 197 BC. Then they fought Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire in Greece and Asia Minor. Rome won again, with an important victory at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC. Later, in the 100s and 70s BC, Rome fought Macedon again and won a final victory at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC. This ended the Macedonian kingdom. Even though Rome didn't immediately take full control of Macedon or Greece, it became clear by the mid-2nd century that Rome was now the main power in the eastern Mediterranean. Local kings and states started to follow Rome's lead. In the late 2nd century BC, Rome fought wars in North Africa and had more conflicts with Celtic tribes in southern Gaul, modern France, and Germanic tribes. The Romans suffered some serious defeats, but eventually came out on top. In the 1st century BC, Rome kept expanding its power through more wars, most famously with Pompey's eastern campaigns in the 60s BC and Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul in the 50s. But this century was also marked by something new and dangerous: civil war. The first big civil conflict began in 91 BC, when Rome's Italian allies rebelled. They had helped Rome win many wars, but didn't feel they were treated fairly, especially because they weren't granted Roman citizenship. This led to the Social War. Rome eventually ended the rebellion by fighting and also by giving some concessions, like offering citizenship. But the Social War opened the door to more civil fighting. In the 80s BC, two top Roman generals, Marius and Sulla, and their followers fought for control. Sulla won, but rebellion continued, especially in Spain, where another general, Sertorius, fought against Sulla's rule. Then, in 49 BC, Julius Caesar marched into Italy with his army from Gaul, starting another major civil war. He was fighting against Pompey and the Senate's forces. The war spread across the Roman world, with battles in Spain, North Africa, and the Balkans. Caesar won in 45 BC and became the most powerful man in Rome. But in 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated. This caused yet another civil war. first between Caesar's supporters and his killers. The killers were defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. But the fighting didn't end. Now Caesar's own allies, mainly Mark Antony and Octavian, turned on each other. In 31 BC, Octavian defeated Antony at the Battle of Actium. 4 years later, he took the name Augustus and became the first emperor of Rome, ending the Republic and starting a new chapter in Roman history. Augustus spent much of his early adult life in war, especially between 44 and 30 BC. So you might think that after he became the sole ruler of Rome, he would want to enjoy a peaceful life. But that's not what happened. In fact, Augustus and his generals added more land to the Roman Empire than anyone else before or after. They took over places like Egypt, northwest Spain, the Alps, and much of the Balkans. It also seems that Augustus had plans to expand into Germany, beyond the Rhine River. One of the main reasons for this military activity was politics. After he defeated Mark Antony, Augustus needed to keep control of the army to protect his power. The easiest way to justify this was by saying that the provinces still needed to be pacified, either because they might rebel or were threatened by enemies outside. In 27 BC, Augustus took charge of this mission for 10 years. That authority was renewed again and again until his death in AD 14. This long-term control has been described as making the emergency permanent. This meant there were still a lot of wars during the first half of Augustus' reign. But plans to conquer Germany came to a sudden stop in AD 9, when 3 Roman legions were trapped and destroyed in the Teutoburg forest. This terrible defeat, known as the Varian disaster, after their commander Varus, likely made the emperors after Augustus more careful about starting new wars. Interestingly, after Augustus, the Roman Empire stopped expanding very much. There were only a couple of major exceptions. One was in AD 43, when Emperor Claudius decided to conquer Britain. He wasn't very experienced in war, so many believe he did it to boost his image. The other big expansion came under Emperor Trajan, who conquered Dacia, modern-day Romania, in the early 100s AD. Trajan was a skilled general, and although he may have started out just trying to punish Dacia, he ended up taking the whole region. Even though there wasn't much new territory added overall, that doesn't mean there were no important wars. After taking Dacia, Trajan tried to conquer Parthia, Rome's powerful eastern neighbor. The Parthians had originally taken over parts of the old Seleucid Empire, and they had already proven themselves in 53 BC by defeating the Roman general Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae. Julius Caesar had been planning to attack Parthia before he was assassinated, but Augustus chose not to follow that path. Instead, he negotiated with the Parthians to return Roman standards, military flags, that had been lost at Carrhae. When they agreed in 20 BC, Augustus presented it as a great victory, even though it was really a diplomatic success, not a military one. Over 100 years later, in AD 115, Trajan invaded Parthia and advanced all the way to the Persian Gulf. But revolts forced him to retreat. Later emperors, like Marcus Aurelius in the 160s and Septimius Severus, also fought wars against Parthia. Severus even managed to take some land in northern Mesopotamia. These Roman victories, however, weakened the Parthian rulers, known as the Arsacid dynasty. In the 200s and 20s, a new Persian family, the Sasanians, overthrew them and formed a new empire. The Sasanians would become one of Rome's toughest enemies in the centuries that followed. Meanwhile, Germanic and Sarmatian tribes started causing more problems along the Danube River in the later 100s. Emperor Marcus Aurelius had to spend a lot of time in the 1700s leading military campaigns to deal with them. Just like in the 1st century BC, war in the Roman world wasn't only about fighting foreign enemies. there were also civil wars. The first major civil war happened in AD 68 to 69, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. It started when Nero, the last emperor from Augustus's family line, the Julio-Claudians, was overthrown. Since Nero had no children, a powerful provincial governor used his army to claim power. This move encouraged other governors with armies to do the same. In the end, Vespasian came out on top and restored peace and order. The second big civil war happened in AD 192 to 193, after the death of Emperor Commodus, who also had no children. Several senators with armies in the provinces fought for power. Septimius Severus eventually won that struggle and became emperor. Internal conflict during the Principate also came in the form of provincial rebellions. Some of the most serious were Jewish revolts. The first was in Judea from AD 66 to 73. The second was in AD 115, involving Jews in Egypt, Libya, and Mesopotamia. The third was the Bar Kokhba revolt in the early 130 during Hadrian's reign. All of these uprisings were serious and required large Roman armies to crush them. There were also major revolts in the western provinces. Two of the most famous are the rebellion in Britain led by Queen Boudica in the early 60s, the revolt by a Gallic noble named Civilis in AD 68. These examples show that warfare in the Roman Empire was not just about conquering new lands, it also meant dealing with dangerous challenges from within. As mentioned earlier, a major new threat to the Roman Empire appeared in the 3rd century, the rise of the Sasanian Persian Empire in the east. This new dynasty quickly organized its power and launched powerful invasions into Roman territory, especially into Syria in 252 and again in 260. The invasion in 260 was especially shocking because it was the first time a Roman emperor, Valerian, was captured by an enemy. At the same time, things were getting worse on the northern borders too. Along the Rhine and Danube rivers, tribes like the Goths and Alemanni began pushing into Roman lands. In 251, the Emperor Decius was killed in battle against the Goths, another first in Roman history. All of these problems in the mid-3rd century led to big changes in Roman leadership. Instead of noblemen from the Senate becoming emperors, now military men of lower social class, often called soldier emperors, took control. These emperors spent most of their time fighting on the frontiers rather than living in Rome. Thanks to their efforts, they began to restore order, pushing back invaders and regaining control in the east against the Persians. In 298, a Roman army defeated the Persian king, and Emperor Diocletian was able to force a tough peace deal on them in 299. This peace gave Rome some new territory east of the Tigris River and created a stable eastern border that lasted until 363. But the 3rd century was also full of civil wars. Armies often supported their own commanders for emperor, and parts of the empire even tried to break away. For example, Emperor Aurelian had to defeat a rebel empire based in the eastern city of Palmyra in the 260s, and then he had to do the same in the west, where a breakaway Gallic empire had formed. To stop this cycle of civil wars, Emperor Diocletian came up with the idea of the tetrarchy, or rule by 4, where power was shared between 4 rulers. But this system fell apart because of the ambitions of one man, Constantine. He fought a civil war from 312 to 324, first in the west and then in the east, and came out as the sole ruler of the empire. Constantine's victory brought new stability. He founded a new eastern capital, Constantinople, which quickly became more important than Rome itself. But this peace didn't last long. After Constantine died, his 3 sons ended up fighting each other and other rivals in a new wave of power struggles. The worst of these came in the 350s, especially when a military officer named Magnentius tried to seize the throne. This chaos encouraged outside enemies to attack Roman lands. In Gaul, Germanic tribes like the Alemanni and Franks took advantage of the situation. It was Constantine's nephew, Julian, who managed to restore order there. He won a big battle against the Alemanni at Strasbourg in 357. Meanwhile, back in the east, the Sasanian Persian king Shapur II became more aggressive. Emperor Constantius II dealt with this wisely. He avoided large battles and focused on strengthening the borders. But Julian, now emperor himself, ruined that strategy when he invaded Persia in 363. He was killed during the campaign. After Julian's death, the Romans made peace with Persia. While it wasn't great for Rome, it helped erase the memory of Rome's earlier victory in 299 from the Persian point of view. Still, the deal brought peace to the eastern frontier for the next 150 years. Although the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire had been stabilized for a while, new problems quickly arose along the Danube River in the 370s. Emperor Valens had already dealt with a rebellion by a rival named Procopius, but in 376, he faced a much bigger issue. Thousands of Goths were asking to enter the empire. They were trying to escape from the Huns, a fierce nomadic group coming from the north. Valens agreed to let one group of Goths in, but things went wrong. The Goths were mistreated and eventually rebelled. They began raiding Roman provinces in the Balkans. In 378, Valens led his army to stop them near the city of Adrianople, but instead of winning, the Romans were badly defeated. Many soldiers were killed, and Valens himself died in the battle. It was one of the worst losses in Roman history. The new emperor, Theodosius, couldn't drive the Goths out. In 382, he made a deal. The Goths could settle on Roman land if they agreed to serve as soldiers. These soldiers were known as foederati, technically allies, but still somewhat independent. Meanwhile, civil war broke out again in the west. First, a general named Magnus Maximus rebelled in 383. Then another commander, Arbogast, did the same in 392. Theodosius marched west twice to stop them and won both times, but he died suddenly in 395. He left the empire to his two young sons. Soon after, the Goths rebelled again, this time led by their general Alaric. In 410, they attacked and looted the city of Rome. While it was more an act of frustration than a clear military strategy, it shocked the empire. In the early 400s, other groups crossed the Rhine and Danube into Roman lands. The most dangerous were the Vandals. In the 400s and 20s, they moved through Gaul and Spain and eventually took over North Africa, the wealthiest part of the Western Empire. Even though Roman emperors tried to take the region back during the mid-400s, they failed. Losing North Africa and its tax money seriously weakened the empire in the west. Other tribes, like the Goths and Franks, also took over parts of the Western Empire. By the end of the 400s, Roman emperors only ruled Italy. In 476, the last Western emperor was removed from power. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire was busy dealing with the Huns. After Attila, the famous Hun leader, died in 453, his empire fell apart. But new threats came from tribes that had once served under him, especially other groups of Goths. The Eastern Empire also had internal problems. Emperor Zeno was unpopular and faced several rebellions in the 470s and 480s. His successor, Anastasius, had to put down a rebellion in the Isaurian region of Anatolia in the 490s. Then came another war with Persia in the early 500s. followed by a major internal rebellion led by a general named Vitalian in the 500s and 10s. It wasn't until Emperor Justinian came to power that Roman military strength began to recover, at least for a while. Early in his reign, he fought an indecisive war with Persia. But in 533 to 534, he successfully reconquered North Africa from the Vandals. He also launched a major campaign to take back Italy from the Goths. By 540, it looked like he might win, but the war dragged on until the early 550s. One reason was that a new war with Persia in 540 forced Justinian to shift troops away from Italy. On top of that, there was a rebellion in North Africa that also needed to be dealt with. Justinian's successor, Emperor Justin II, made a major mistake in 572 when he restarted the war with Persia. The war went badly from the start and ended up lasting for almost 20 years. At the same time, a new danger appeared on the empire's northern border. The Avars, a nomadic group, began threatening the Danube frontier. Finally, when peace with Persia was made in 591, the new emperor, Maurice, was able to focus on stopping the Avars and Slavic raiders in the Balkans during the 590s. But things fell apart in 602, when Maurice's own troops, unhappy and rebellious, turned against him. He was overthrown and replaced by one of his officers, Phocas. This political chaos gave the Persians a perfect chance to attack again. And this time, they were more successful than ever before. By 626, Persian forces had taken control of most of Rome's eastern provinces, including Egypt, which was vital for the empire's economy. They even reached the Bosporus, right outside Constantinople. If they had captured the city, the Roman Empire likely would have ended. Part of Persia's success came from the Roman Civil War. Around 610, Heraclius, the governor of Africa, sailed east to challenge Phocas. He won and became emperor. Over the next 10 years, Heraclius rebuilt the Roman army and launched a counterattack. By the mid-620s, he had defeated the Persians, and in 628, he celebrated a great victory. But Heraclius's success didn't last long. The long war had weakened both the Roman and Persian empires. So, when Arab-Muslim forces began expanding from the Arabian Peninsula, neither side could stop them. The Persian Sasanian Empire collapsed entirely, while Heraclius suffered a crushing defeat in Palestine and lost many of Rome's eastern provinces. After these losses, the Roman Empire was reduced to just parts of Anatolia and the Eastern Balkans. With Egypt gone, the empire's economy was also badly damaged. The emperors had to completely rethink how their military and government worked. From the mid-600s onward, the Roman Empire changed so much that modern historians now call it the Byzantine Empire, a new version of the empire, very different from what it had been during late antiquity. When we talk about the Roman army, it might sound like it was one big, unchanging organization. But in reality, the Roman military went through many changes over time. It was made up of different types of soldiers, and its structure evolved from the Republic all the way through to late antiquity. This section explains the most important of those changes, helping set the stage for the themes that follow. At the same time, these changes themselves were some of the biggest results of Rome's long history of warfare. In the time of the Republic, the Roman army mainly had two types of soldiers: Roman citizens who served in the legions, and soldiers provided by Rome's Italian allies. Later, especially in the last 2 centuries before the empire, the army also began using many non-Italian troops. Roman citizens were usually drafted once a year, depending on how many soldiers were needed. After a campaign, they would return home. But as Rome started fighting more and more overseas, some legions stayed in service for many years. Technically, citizens could be required to serve for up to 16 years, but most finished their duty after 6 years of continuous service. So at this time, being a soldier wasn't a full-time job. It was something temporary. Still, during the civil wars near the end of the Republic, many soldiers stayed longer, which helped pave the way for the more permanent army system introduced by Augustus later on. The structure of the army also changed during the Republic. In the Middle Republic, legions were organized into small units called maniples. By the Late Republic, these were replaced by larger units called cohorts. Maniples were sized based on the type of soldier. New soldiers were placed into 4 groups based on their age and experience. The youngest became velites, lightly armed troops who ran ahead to harass the enemy. Behind them came 3 more heavily armed groups, the hastati, the principes, and the triarii. These soldiers carried big shields, armor, helmets, swords, and spears. The main difference was that the triarii carried long, thrusting spears instead of throwing javelins, a leftover from Rome's earlier phalanx-style army. Maniples usually had 120 men in the hastati and principes, or 60 in the triarii. These smaller units were much more flexible and easier to move than the older, more rigid phalanx formations. That flexibility helped the Romans defeat the Macedonian phalanx at the Battle of Cynocephali in 197 BC. At that time, a legion was made up of 30 maniples. By the 1st century BC, however, Rome began organizing its army into cohorts, each with 480 men divided into 6 centuries of 80 men each. Despite the name, a century didn't have 100 men. Each legion now had 10 cohorts. This shift from maniples to cohorts seems to have been an effort to find the best mix between flexibility and strength, and it likely began during the wars with Hannibal. Along with these changes, the soldiers' equipment also became more standardized. For example, the triaries' long spears were eventually replaced by javelins, giving all soldiers a more uniform set of weapons. The Italian allies played a key role in Rome's military success during the Republic. By the late 3rd century BC, they made up more than half of Rome's total military forces. A historian from that time noted that in 216 BC, the number of Allied infantry was about the same as in the Roman legions, while Allied cavalry was actually 3 times greater. These numbers may have changed over time, but they show how important the Allies were. The Italian allies provided troops based on agreements made with Rome, which were written down in official documents. Their infantry units were called aile, meaning wings, because they stood on the sides of the Roman legions during battle. Their cavalry units were called turmae. Most historians believe these allied troops were trained and equipped in nearly the same way as Roman soldiers. So when these allies were later granted Roman citizenship after the Social War in the early 1st century BC, it was relatively easy to merge their units into the legions. In the last 2 centuries, Rome also made increasing use of non-Italian soldiers, but this has received much less attention. These weren't allied forces, but men recruited directly from the provinces, such as Sicily and Asia. These troops didn't have a special name, though some sources use the term auxilia externa, foreign support forces, which is useful for understanding their role. These provincial troops were used for both fighting and guarding duties, and coastal towns were often required to provide ships and sailors as well. After the Social War, when Italian allies became Roman citizens and stopped being a separate group in the army, these foreign auxiliaries became the main secondary part of the Roman military. In the 1st century BC, wars overseas and civil conflicts meant some soldiers served longer than the usual 6 years. But it was Augustus who truly transformed the Roman army. After winning the final civil war in 30 BC, he found that there were as many as 60 legions still active. He reduced this number to 28 and stationed them, along with auxiliary units, in the provinces that needed the most protection. Starting in AD 5, Roman soldiers now served for at least 20 years. Instead of creating new legions for each new war, Augustus kept a permanent army and simply moved existing units where they were needed. Many modern historians call this a professional army, but that term can be misleading because it suggests modern ideas that don't always apply. Still, this change was extremely important and had a huge impact on Roman politics, government finances, and even the identity of the Roman military itself. The Roman legions continued to be organized using the cohort system, but over time, they were joined by other military units called auxilia. These units came from a tradition that began in the late Republic, known as auxilia externa. Like the Italian allies in earlier times, these troops were not Roman citizens. They came from the provinces of the empire. Over time, auxiliaries made up more than half of the total army. During the civil wars at the end of the Republic, generals relied heavily on these non-citizen troops because Roman citizen manpower was already stretched thin. By the time Augustus came to power, auxiliary forces had become a regular part of the Roman military and were especially valuable because they brought skills that the heavy infantry of the legions didn't have, such as more mobile infantry, different types of cavalry, and skilled missile troops like archers or slingers. Infantry auxiliaries were organized into cohorts and cavalry into alae, usually with about 500 men, though some larger units of up to 1,000 men appeared by the end of the century, the end of the 1st century AD. At first, the main difference between legions and auxiliaries was citizenship. Legionaries were citizens, auxiliaries were not. But this distinction became less clear during the 2nd century, as more non-citizens gained Roman citizenship, and some auxiliaries became more like regular legionaries. There were also special units called numeri, made up of soldiers recruited from tribal areas on the edge of the empire. These weren't standard in size or structure. In addition to all this, a permanent military presence was created inside the city of Rome itself, the Praetorian Guard. This elite unit was originally formed to protect the emperor, but over time it grew into a powerful and prestigious force that even went with emperors on campaign. It may have started with about 4,500 men, but grew to around 10,000 by the end of the 1st century. Later, in the 3rd century, major changes began to take place across the Roman military system. Although many of these changes happened gradually, they had a lasting impact. One important shift was the creation of temporary task forces by pulling groups of soldiers, called vexellations, from frontier units to form new armies for specific campaigns. Over time, these task forces became more permanent and formed what was known as the comitatus, a mobile army that traveled with the emperor. While the names of the units, like legions and auxilia, stayed the same, their size and structure changed. By late antiquity, most military units were much smaller, typically 1,000 to 1,500 men. This likely happened because the large mixed legions of earlier times were split into smaller, more specialized units. Even though individual units were smaller, the overall size of the army grew, and more cavalry units were added in the 3rd and 4th centuries. One of the biggest changes was a shift in how and where the army was positioned throughout the empire. During the Principate, most Roman military units were stationed along the empire's borders to defend against outside threats. But in the early 4th century, there was a major reorganization. The best troops were pulled back from the frontiers and formed into mobile field armies called comitatenses, a more formal version of the older comitatus, which had followed the emperor on campaigns. The units that stayed on the frontiers became known as limitanae. By the end of the 4th century, there were 5 of these field armies in the Eastern Empire, 2 near Constantinople, and 1 each in Thrace, Illyricum, and the eastern provinces. Each was led by a senior general called a Magister Militum, or Master of the Soldiers. A similar system existed in the Western Empire, although command there was more centralized. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian added new field armies in Armenia, North Africa, and Italy as part of his efforts to rebuild and expand the empire. These field armies needed to be mobile, so cavalry units, especially mounted archers, increased in number, influenced by Rome's earlier battles with steppe nomads like the Huns. Still, infantry remained an essential part of the Roman military and was never replaced entirely by cavalry. In addition to the field armies and frontier troops, another important group appeared in the late 4th century: the Foederati. These were soldiers from barbarian groups allowed to settle inside the empire in exchange for military service. Later, in the 6th century, elite units called Bucellarii became prominent. These were personal troops loyal to individual generals. There were also allies from outside the empire, known as Simikoi or Enspondoi, and one of the most important among them were Arab groups living along the eastern frontier. All of this shows that the Roman army was never a fixed or unchanging system. In fact, one of its greatest strengths was its ability to adapt to new challenges and use the skills of others. Some people like to describe the Roman army as a perfect, unstoppable machine. But that image is misleading. It gives the false idea that the army never lost, that its soldiers acted like robots, and that everything always ran smoothly. In reality, the Roman army faced defeats, dealt with cowardice, mutiny, and even rebellion. What made it powerful wasn't perfection, but its ability to change, adjust, and take a practical approach by learning from others and using what worked. The importance of war in Roman historical writing is clear, even from books that haven't survived. For example, we know that Coelius Antipater wrote a history of the Hannibalic War, Pliny the Elder wrote about the Germanic Wars, and John the Lydian wrote about Justinian's early wars with Persia. While many ancient histories are lost, the ones that do survive, even in part, are incredibly valuable. However, it's important to read them with a critical eye. We shouldn't take everything they say as fact, and we should also look at other types of evidence to get a fuller picture. Before looking at those other sources, it helps to first think about how reliable ancient historical writing is in general, whether it's about military topics or anything else. Most modern historians agree we can't blindly trust ancient accounts, and some scholars today go even further, focusing on how ancient writers were trained in rhetoric or persuasive speech, which was a big part of education back then. Because of this, some believe ancient histories are more like carefully crafted stories than factual reports. That said, ancient historians who were writing about events from their own time knew they could be challenged by others, so many still tried to be accurate and careful with their sources. Of course, there were limits to the information they had, and their personal biases influenced how they told the story. But we shouldn't assume everything they wrote was just spin or style. Roman historical writing in Latin began in the early 2nd century BC, but the first major surviving works come from the 1st century BC. Interestingly, one of the earliest important works wasn't by a Roman, but by a Greek historian named Polybius. He lived during the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BC, and he was deeply interested in Rome's military rise. After Rome defeated his homeland of Achaia, Polybius was taken to Italy in 167 BC. Even though he had every reason to resent Rome, he didn't write a bitter attack. Instead, he tried to understand how a small Italian city had managed to conquer so much of the Greek and Mediterranean world. Since this transformation was largely due to military power, war became a major theme in his writing. Sadly, much of Polybius's work has been lost, but what survives gives us key details about Rome's toughest military campaigns, especially during the war with Hannibal and Rome's conflicts with the Eastern Greek kingdoms. Polybius wasn't just writing from second-hand knowledge either. He had been a cavalry commander in Achaia and later became close to the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus, joining him on military campaigns. This gave him first-hand experience with war, and he even wrote a separate book on military tactics, though that one has also been lost. The first major Roman history written in Latin that has survived in large parts is the work of Titus Livius, better known as Livy. He wrote during the reign of Emperor Augustus and aimed to tell the entire story of Rome, starting from its legendary founding nearly 800 years earlier. Because of this huge goal, his work was very different from Polybius. Livy covered a much wider time span, included many more topics, and wasn't focused on answering a single central question like Polybius was. Also, unlike Polybius, Livy had no known military experience. Still, war plays a major role in his history and shapes how the story is told. For example, he describes the Centuriate Assembly, a political body that was closely tied to Rome's military structure. Since Livy was writing about events that happened long before his own time, he relied heavily on earlier writers, including Polybius. But the further back he went in time, the fewer reliable sources he had to work with. Much of Livy's massive history has unfortunately been lost. The first 10 books that survive cover events up to the early 3rd century BC, while books 21 to 45 focus on the Hannibalic War and Rome's eventual defeat of Macedonia in 168 BC. Just before Livy's time, another key figure wrote about war: Julius Caesar. He wrote detailed accounts of his campaigns in Gaul during the 50s BC and the Civil War. He fought against Pompey and the Senate in 49 to 48 BC. Caesar's writing style was plain and simple, and he used the third person to refer to himself, which gave his works a tone of objectivity. Because of this, people at the time called his writings commentary, which means something like notes or memoirs. But even though they seem straightforward, Caesar's writings were carefully crafted to support his political goals. In the Gallic War, he wanted to make sure the Roman people saw his military victories. In the Civil War, he aimed to defend his actions and show that he was acting in Rome's best interest. So while these works are incredibly valuable because they come from someone who actually led the campaigns, we also need to remember that Caesar was trying to shape how people saw him. That said, his accounts don't completely hide his setbacks. He openly mentions defeats like those at Gergovia and Dyrrhachium, so they still offer a mostly honest picture of what happened. One of the most important historical works about Roman warfare from the 1st century AD is the account of the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD, written by the Jewish historian Josephus. Often called the Greek Livy, Josephus provides detailed descriptions of battles, sieges, and Roman military practices. His book is written in Greek and even begins in the style of the famous Greek historian Thucydides, claiming to describe the greatest war of his time. Thucydides' influence can also be seen throughout the work, both in its literary style and in its themes. Josephus had first-hand experience. He fought for the Jewish side early in the war, but later surrendered and aligned himself with the Romans. This change of sides, along with his likely use of reports written by the emperors Vespasian and Titus, complicates how we read his work. Moving into the early 2nd century AD, the Roman historian Tacitus provides more insight into warfare, especially in the surviving parts of his Histories, which cover the Civil War of 69 AD. although Tacitus complained that his time was less glorious than earlier ages, filled with great wars and heroic conquests, and despite probably having limited military experience himself, his writings remain important. His other works, including parts of the Annals and his biography of Agricola, also contain key information about military events. The last major Roman historian writing in Latin was Ammianus Marcellinus, who lived in the second half of the 4th century. Like Caesar and Josephus, Ammianus had real military experience. But unlike them, he wasn't a commander. He served as a staff officer to a top general, giving him a close-up view of warfare during some of the Roman Empire's most troubled years. He fought on the eastern frontier against the Persian Sasanian Empire, including during the Persian invasion of 359 and Emperor Julian's failed campaign in 363. However, two of the biggest battles in his surviving history, Julian's victory at Strasbourg in 357 and Emperor Valens' defeat by the Goths at Adrianople in 378, were not events he witnessed himself. This may be why his descriptions of those battles feel less vivid and detailed. Also, Ammianus clearly admired Julian, which sometimes makes it harder to tell where his loyalty may have influenced how he presented events. The last major Greek historian writing in the classical style was Procopius, who lived in the mid-6th century during the reign of Emperor Justinian. This was a time filled with military action, giving Procopius plenty to write about, whether it was the wars in the east against the Persians or in the west against the Vandals and the Goths. Although he wasn't a soldier himself, Procopius witnessed many of these events firsthand because he served as the secretary to Justinian's top general, Belisarius. Like Josephus, Procopius clearly admired earlier historians such as Thucydides and Herodotus, and he mentions them in the introduction to his Wars, even hinting that he wanted to compete with them. His writing shows some bias. For example, he praises Belisarius heavily in the early parts of the book and blames mistakes on other people. He's also critical of Justinian's leadership in many places. Still, his full work has survived, and it's incredibly valuable because it offers a huge amount of detail about warfare in his time. Another important historical account from the early 6th century is the chronicle traditionally linked to Joshua the Stylite. This text gives a detailed account of Rome's war with Persia during the early 500s. The author wasn't a soldier, but he lived in the region where the war took place, likely a monk in the city of Edessa in northern Mesopotamia, and he used reports from eyewitnesses to help tell the story. What makes this chronicle special is that it was written outside the usual Greco-Roman tradition. It was written in Syriac, a form of the Aramaic language, and unlike classical histories that tried to follow in the footsteps of writers like Thucydides, this one followed a different style. Because of that, it feels less restricted by the rules of traditional ancient historical writing, and offers a different, more direct perspective on the events of the time. Ancient historical writings about war are very important for understanding warfare in the Roman world, but many other types of Roman literature, like letters, plays, and poems, also include useful bits of information. These will be mentioned later, but they are too scattered and varied to be discussed here. However, there is one more type of writing that deserves special attention: military manuals. The most famous of these is by a man named Vegetius. Even though he was writing in the late 4th or early 5th century, and many of his comments were about his own time, he used older sources from the Roman Republic and early Empire, which can make his work a bit tricky to understand. Still, his book was very influential, especially in the Middle Ages. Other earlier examples of military manuals include Frontinus and Polyaenus, who wrote about clever strategies, Onosander, who wrote about how generals should behave, and Arrian, who also wrote military texts. A later example is a more practical manual for generals, written around the end of the 6th century and linked to Emperor Maurus. Of course, like all types of writing, these literary sources can be biased, whether the author meant to be or not. That's why non-literary documentary sources like inscriptions, papyrus documents, pieces of pottery with writing, and wooden tablets are also very valuable. These documents have their own kinds of bias, like only surviving in certain places or from certain people, but they give us a different view of Roman warfare. Among them, inscriptions are the most useful because they've been found all over the Roman Empire. These inscriptions were usually carved into stone, pottery, or metal. Unfortunately, many metal ones were melted down and reused, so not many have survived. But one special type of metal inscription has been very important for learning about the Roman military: diplomas. These were given to soldiers in auxiliary units when they finished their service. The diploma officially gave them Roman citizenship, which made it extremely valuable. Because of that, soldiers often buried them to keep them safe. Over 1,200 have been found today, and they give us useful information about where soldiers came from and the structure of the army during the Roman Empire. Many stone inscriptions from ancient times have survived, and the most common type is the epitaph. Gravestones with writing. There are hundreds of thousands of these, and many belong to people who served in the Roman army, especially during the Principate. Some inscriptions are very short, just listing the soldier's name, age, rank, and the unit they served in. Others give more detailed information about the person's life and career, sometimes even with pictures. These detailed ones usually belonged to soldiers who had a rank. These inscriptions have helped historians understand how military careers worked and how units moved around the empire. Interestingly, most of these gravestones don't mention that the soldier died in battle. This is likely because soldiers who died in combat were often buried in mass graves near the battlefield, and only a few got special memorials. Another type of important inscription is when soldiers made offerings to gods. These are useful for learning about religious practices in the military. There are also inscriptions showing imperial orders about military behavior, like how soldiers treated civilians or took supplies. Apart from stone, another very important material for documents was papyrus, which was like ancient paper made from the papyrus plant. It was used all over the Roman world, but it decays easily in wet climates, so most surviving examples come from dry places like Egypt. Even though Egypt only became part of the Roman Empire during Augustus' rule, we have hundreds of thousands of papyrus documents from there, many still sitting in museums waiting to be studied. Since Egypt wasn't a place where big wars happened, most of the military documents from there are about small matters, like soldiers doing police work. But Egypt was very important to Rome because it provided a lot of grain, so a military presence was always kept there. One useful collection from the 4th century is the letters of a commander named Abenaeus, stationed at a fort in the Fayum. His letters tell us a lot about daily life and how soldiers interacted with civilians. Even more interesting military documents on papyrus were found outside Egypt, at a Roman fortress called Dura Europos, on the eastern frontier of the empire. There, archaeologists discovered a set of papyrus documents from a unit of archers from Palmyra, who were stationed there in the early 3rd century. One of the most famous of these is the Feriale Duranum, a calendar showing the official religious celebrations observed by soldiers during that time. In addition to stone and papyrus, the Romans also wrote on other materials. One of these was ostraca, pieces of broken pottery, used like scrap paper for writing short notes or records. Thousands of these have been found at Roman military sites, like Mons Claudianus in the Egyptian desert, and Bu Nyem in North Africa. These offer us useful details about everyday army life and how things were managed. Another writing material was wooden tablets. These were used to write both official and personal messages. Some of the most exciting finds have come from Vindolanda, a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall in Britain. There, archaeologists found wooden letters and records that give us insights into how the army handled supplies, how educated the soldiers were, and even what social life was like in the camp in the 2nd century AD. But it's not just written texts that help us understand Roman warfare. Archaeological remains, such as military camps, forts, weapons, and even pictures carved into stone, also give us valuable information. By looking at how forts and camps were built, we can learn how soldiers lived and how they interacted with local people. Studying weapons helps us understand how Roman arms evolved over time to meet new challenges. And images, like those carved on monuments, can sometimes correct or challenge what ancient texts claim. For example, the Roman writer Vegetius said soldiers stopped wearing armor in the late 4th century, but archaeological finds suggest otherwise. One site that has provided a wealth of different types of evidence is Dura Europos. Along with its famous papyri, this fortress has also given us remains of buildings, weapons, artwork, and even siege tunnels used in battle. In contrast, battlefield sites are harder to find, but there have been some big discoveries. One of them is the site where Roman general Varus and his legions were ambushed and massacred in AD 9. Found near Osnabrück in Germany, this site has yielded over 3,000 military objects, including weapons, tools, clothing, and jewelry. Another amazing find was underwater, off the coast of western Sicily. Archaeologists discovered remains from the final sea battle of the First Punic War, including parts of ships, bronze helmets, and nearly a dozen decorated bronze rams from warships. These discoveries show how much physical evidence can tell us about Roman warfare, alongside what was written down. Modern historians often say that Republican Rome was a society built around war. It fought battles almost constantly, and many Roman leaders seemed to view war in a positive light. This section explores why people think that, adds some important points that complicate this idea, and asks whether these same attitudes continued in later Roman history. Talking about war also leads to the question of how Romans thought about peace, though this has been less studied. The idea that Rome was very militaristic became more popular in the 1970s. This may have been influenced by modern events like the Vietnam War, which made people question imperialism. Before that, many believed Rome only went to war when it had to, reluctantly and for good reasons. This older idea was supported by stories about something called the Fetial Law. According to Roman authors like Livy and Dionysius, special priests performed rituals to make sure Rome only fought wars that were fair and approved by the gods. They would ask the enemy to make things right and call on the god Jupiter to witness. This made it seem like Rome had a strong tradition of only fighting just wars. But recent scholars have challenged this view. They say these rituals might have made sense early in Rome's history, when it was just one of many small communities in central Italy. At that time, conflicts over cattle or local rivalries were common. However, as Rome expanded across Italy, and then the whole Mediterranean, it became less believable that every war had a holy or fair reason behind it. Instead of focusing on the fetial rituals, modern historians have pointed out other signs that war was deeply rooted in Roman society. War played a big role in the political system. Roman citizenship was closely tied to military service, and early voting groups were based on a citizen's ability to buy his own weapons. The top leaders each year, the consuls, were expected to lead armies. Winning in war brought fame and honor to these leaders and their families. The biggest reward was a triumph, where a victorious general got to parade through Rome while the people cheered. We know less about what ordinary soldiers thought, since the ancient writers were from the upper class. Still, it's likely that the promise of loot made war attractive for many. Rome's way of dealing with defeated Italian cities also shows how important war was. Instead of asking for money, Rome demanded soldiers. That only made sense if Rome planned to keep fighting. As one historian said, war wasn't just something Rome did. It was the very foundation of how the Republic worked. In the middle years of the Roman Republic, it seems like Rome went to war almost every year. This supports the idea that the Roman elite wasn't at all hesitant to start wars. There's even a famous tradition about the Temple of Janus in the Roman Forum. The doors of this temple were said to stay open when Rome was at war, and only close during peace. Ancient writers claimed the doors were closed just once before Augustus's time, after the First Punic War in the 3rd century BC. There were also many war-related religious rituals tied to Mars, the god of war, held in March and October. These months marked the beginning and end of the war season, and made it feel like war was a natural part of Rome's yearly cycle. These practices clearly show that war was a big part of Roman life, and that the upper class supported it. Still, there are some points that make this picture more complex. First, although Rome often fought wars, not every year involved major fighting. Some years saw only small military actions, and some periods were surprisingly calm. For example, the 5th century BC may have been relatively peaceful, and from the mid-2nd century BC to the end of the Republic, war became less constant. There were bursts of intense conflict, followed by quieter times. In fact, the historian Polybius says that Rome started a war against the Dalmatians in 156 BC, partly because the senators didn't want Roman men to grow weak after 12 years of peace since their last major war. Also, the rituals linked to Janus and Mars might not mean as much as people once thought. Another important factor was the sacred boundary of the city, called the Pomerium, which separated military from civilian life. Because of this, the Roman army had to meet outside the city, in a place called the Field of Mars. A temple for Bellona, the goddess of war, was built there too. Even victorious generals needed special permission to bring their soldiers into the city for a victory parade. This careful separation between military and civilian spaces shows that even though Rome fought often, there were still limits on how much the city itself became militarized. Some modern historians believe that Republican Rome was very focused on war, but others have offered a more balanced view. One such historian, Arthur Eckstein, says Rome wasn't unusually aggressive compared to other states at the time. He explains that the world of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, both in Italy and around the Mediterranean, was chaotic and dangerous. No one power was in control, so all states, including Rome, had to be ready for war just to survive. In this setting, Rome's constant military activity wasn't strange. It was normal. So while Rome was certainly militaristic, it wasn't alone in this, and its wars were sometimes responses to threats rather than acts of pure aggression. This view adds some nuance to how we see Roman imperialism. It suggests Rome's actions weren't only about conquest, but also about defending itself in a violent world. However, some argue that this doesn't explain everything. Rome had strong arrangements with its allies that gave it access to huge numbers of soldiers, which may have encouraged it to start wars more easily. Over time, especially in the 2nd century BC, Rome went from being just one of many powers to being the single dominant force in the Mediterranean. As this happened, Rome fought fewer external wars, but not because it lost interest in expansion. Rather, there was simply no one left strong enough to challenge it. Even then, Rome still expanded its territory, showing that its militarism wasn't only about reacting to others. Also, as Rome became more powerful, internal conflict became a bigger problem. Civil wars began to appear, starting with the Social War against Rome's Italian allies and continuing with major conflicts in the 80s, 70s, and 40s BC, which eventually ended the Republic. These civil wars happened partly because control over Rome's growing empire became extremely valuable and people were willing to fight for it. This was very different from the earlier days when Rome had to fight just to survive among other small powers. When Augustus became the first emperor, things changed. In the Republic, military glory was a big deal for elite politicians. They used victories to gain fame and power. But Augustus took control of most of the provinces where Roman legions were based, and made sure only his chosen generals, acting under his name, could command them. Victories no longer earned personal triumphs like in the old days. Instead, generals got small honors, like wearing a laurel crown or getting a statue. Whether Augustus planned it this way or not, it worked in his favor. No one else could use military success to become a political rival. Later emperors, especially those without military backgrounds, were often suspicious of successful generals. Some were even removed or pushed aside, like Corbulo under Nero or Agricola under Domitian. This fear of powerful generals likely made emperors more careful about starting new wars, helping explain the more cautious military policy of the imperial period. In the later Roman Empire, especially from the late 3rd century onward, members of the senatorial elite were mostly pushed out of military leadership. This happened gradually, but by this time, military commands were mainly given to men from the equestrian class, those with real military experience. Some sources say this change was made by the Emperor Gallienus, but even if it wasn't a formal decision, the result is clear. The old elite no longer led armies. Unlike before, many of these equestrians had earned their rank through years of service, climbing up from lower positions. Over time, especially in the late 200s, some of these experienced soldiers even became emperors themselves. Many of them came from the Balkans, an area that had become a key place for finding soldiers. These changes happened because the Roman world was going through serious problems. Rome faced strong new enemies, the Sasanian Empire in the east, and larger, more organized barbarian groups in the north. There were also more civil wars again. In some ways, Rome's position in the world was going backward. It was no longer the one dominant power, but one of several strong players. This situation brought about the rise of what we call soldier emperors, and the Roman army grew bigger and more important than ever. Some historians call this period one of growing militarization, meaning the military had more control and influence. But even with this shift, it's important to look more closely and not oversimplify what was really happening. In the later Roman Empire, even though the language of victory and power stayed the same, the empire wasn't really in a position to expand its borders like it had during the Republic. That's an important difference. Emperors in the 3rd and 4th centuries often had military backgrounds, but the system created by Diocletian and Constantine clearly separated military and civilian roles. This was likely done to stop generals from becoming too powerful, and it shows that despite having many soldier emperors, Rome wasn't completely taken over by the military. By the end of the 4th century, it became rare for emperors to have military experience, and they almost never led their armies themselves. This change happened partly because emperors wanted to build dynasties, and partly because 2 emperors had died in battle. When Theodosius I died young, his sons, who lacked military training, took over, which gave powerful generals more influence at court, especially in the western part of the empire. It wasn't until the 6th century, under Emperor Justinian, that Rome made a real effort to expand again. He launched campaigns to take back North Africa from the Vandals and Italy from the Goths. But rather than new conquests, these were efforts to win back lands lost in the 5th century. Religion played a role in Justinian's decision too. He wanted to replace the Arian Christian regimes in those areas with Orthodox Christianity. Even though these campaigns had some success, the Roman Empire still had to deal with the powerful Sasanian Persian Empire, which matched Rome in strength and resources. This rivalry limited how far Roman emperors could go. When the Islamic conquests in the early 7th century destroyed the Sasanian Empire, that limit disappeared. But at the same time, the Roman Empire lost much of its own territory, especially Egypt, which was vital for the economy. This forced the Romans to rethink how their state was organized and what their goals should be. During the Roman Republic, war was such a central part of life that peace wasn't discussed much or seen as something to celebrate. Latin had lots of words related to war, but very few that praised peace. Even the goddess Pax, peace, didn't appear in Roman religion until the end of the Republic. In contrast, the Roman Empire, or Principate, is often linked with the idea of the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. This idea was strongly promoted by Augustus, who used monuments like the Altar of Augustan Peace and other forms of media to present himself as the one who ended the chaos of civil wars. People across the empire, especially in regions not usually affected by fighting, appreciated the peace he brought. Later, emperors continued this theme. For example, Tiberius had the Senate declare that civil war had ended thanks to Augustus' divine influence, and after his own civil war, Vespasian built a temple of peace in Rome. But for Augustus, peace didn't just mean the absence of civil war, it also meant securing the empire by keeping control over unstable provinces. This shows that in Roman thinking, peace came from victory, not from mutual agreement. Rome expected others to surrender and accept Roman rule. Roman commanders made this clear. They told foreign envoys that peace was only for those who had given up. Augustus himself described peace through victories, and some even said peace could only be kept with weapons. Others, especially Rome's enemies, saw Roman peace as nothing more than destruction and slavery. In fact, there was a belief among many Romans that peace could be dangerous. Without an enemy to fight, they thought people became lazy and lost their moral strength. This idea was used to justify wars like the one against the Dalmatians in 156 BC. Some historians also blamed the fall of Carthage for making Rome too soft and divided, leading to political violence. Tacitus said soldiers in Syria became weak after too many peaceful years, while the Britons stayed strong because they hadn't known such peace. Even when Rome had no choice but to negotiate peace, like with the Dacians under Domitian or with various barbarian groups in late antiquity, the deals often involved giving money in exchange for peace. Though practical, this kind of bought peace was criticized. Some Roman elites saw it as shameful. One senator, when asked to pay the Gothic leader Alaric to avoid invasion, angrily said, "This is not peace, it's slavery." Even though the Romans usually had a positive view of war and didn't talk much about peace, there are a few surprising moments in Roman sources where people imagined an end to war. For example, the poet Martial wrote a line where a scythe says that thanks to the emperor's peace, it is now used for farming instead of fighting. But this was said after a military victory, so it may not mean much. In 382, a speaker named Themistius told the emperor Theodosius that people in Thrace were turning their weapons into farming tools after a long period of violence. Again, This was said to support a political decision, making peace with the Goths, rather than showing a true shift in thinking about war. In the 6th century, a Roman diplomat said peace was better than war's uncertainty, but he was trying to convince Persia to accept a peace deal, so it was more practical than idealistic. A more unusual story is about the Emperor Probus in the 3rd century, who was said to want to get rid of the army entirely. This claim comes from a source called the Historia Augusta, which many historians don't fully trust. Some think the story is a joke or a parody, possibly making fun of Christian ideas about peace. Others believe it reflects a wish to bring back more power to the Senate instead of the military. Either way, it doesn't seem to show a real anti-war message. Still, the link to Christian beliefs is interesting. Christianity introduced some new ways of thinking about war and peace. While early Christian texts and thinkers didn't completely reject war, they did ask more questions about violence and talked more positively about peace, especially using ideas from the Old Testament. But when Christian emperors came to power, starting in the 4th century, they didn't change much. Leaders like Constantine were military men dealing with big threats and didn't have the time or interest to rethink the role of war. Even St. Augustine's ideas about just war didn't have much effect right away. Instead, in the later Roman Empire, war started to be seen more and more as a religious conflict, fighting not just enemies, but heretics and people of different faiths, like the Persians or Arian Christian Vandals and Goths. During the Roman Republic, war was such an important part of life that it's no surprise the Romans created many rituals to celebrate victory. These ceremonies show how closely war and religion were connected in Roman culture, and also how military success helped boost political power. Even though Rome won many wars, it still faced defeats from time to time, especially in later centuries. So, while we can learn a lot from how they celebrated victories, it's also helpful to see how they reacted when things went wrong, how they explained failure, and whether those explanations changed over time. One of the main ways Romans celebrated victory was by honoring the goddess Victoria, who represented military success. Her cult became visible in the early 200s BC. A statue of her was placed in the Forum, and a temple was built for her on the Palatine Hill before an important war, likely to gain her favor. Later on, commanders like Cato the Elder promised to build temples to her during their campaigns. Victoria also appeared on coins and on items used in war, like decorated ship rams. Over time, other gods got names linked to victory too, like Jupiter Victor and Mars Invictus. As Roman politics became more competitive, generals tried to outdo each other in how they honored Victoria. Marius built many statues after his victories, but Sulla went further, adding public games in her name. Then Pompey built temples for several gods with victory titles, and Caesar expanded Sulla's games. Eventually, Augustus brought the worship of Victoria into everyday political life. He placed a statue and an altar for her in the Senate, where senators offered incense before their meetings. Another way Romans showed gratitude for military success was through supplications, special days of prayer and sacrifice to thank the gods after big victories. These needed approval from the Senate and usually lasted 1 to 5 days in earlier times. But later, as politics became more competitive, these days became longer. Pompey got 10 days, but Caesar was given 15, then 20, then even 40 and 50 days for different victories. Augustus claimed that over his lifetime, he was awarded a total of 890 days of Thanksgiving, showing just how important these rituals had become in politics. During the Roman Republic, the supplicatio, a public thanksgiving to the gods, was often the first step toward the most famous and important celebration of military success: the triumph. A triumph was a grand ceremony that allowed a victorious general to parade through the streets of Rome in a chariot pulled by 4 horses. He wore special clothes and was followed by his soldiers, captured treasures, prisoners, and even images showing his battles and the cities or peoples he had defeated. The event ended with the general offering a sacrifice at the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, showing that the celebration was also religious. But it was just as political. Such a public display gave the commander fame and helped increase his and his family's political power. Because of its prestige, the Senate's permission was needed to hold a triumph, and this made it even more desirable. There was also a smaller ceremony called the Ovatio, where the general walked instead of riding in a chariot and wore regular clothing with a crown of myrtle instead of laurel. Although a triumph usually lasted only a day or 2, generals found ways to make the memory last. They built statues, temples, and arches, often with inscriptions to remind everyone of their achievements. Even their homes were decorated with captured treasures. And these decorations had to stay, reminding anyone who passed by of the past glory. The victorious general could wear a laurel crown at public games, and after his death, his family would honor him by wearing his triumphal robes at funerals and speaking proudly of his achievements. Later, during Augustus' rule, triumphs became something only the emperor or his family could have. This change increased the ceremony's prestige, but it also meant triumphs became rarer. While there had been one every few years during the Republic, only a small number happened during the next 2 centuries. This was partly because fewer emperors personally led military campaigns, and because the empire wasn't expanding much anymore. Instead, emperors celebrated their victories in other ways. They created dramatic ceremonies like the Adventus, the emperor's formal arrival in a city, which took over some aspects of the triumph. Still, victory remained central to Roman imperial power. Emperors, especially Augustus, made sure to connect their rule with military success. Augustus celebrated his victories at Actium and Alexandria by founding cities called Nicopolis and organizing regular games. Later emperors built many monuments, such as arches and columns, not just in Rome, but across the empire. They also gave themselves special victory names, featured victory themes on coins, and held religious festivals to mark past triumphs. Victory became such a key part of Roman imperial identity that some scholars even describe it as a kind of theology of victory. In the 3rd century, victory became even more important for the Roman Empire. First, the empire was struggling militarily, and second, a new form of government called the Tetrarchy needed strong reasons to be accepted. So when victories did happen, they were used to boost the power and image of the leaders. For example, in 260, an altar was built in Augsburg to honor the goddess Victoria after a Roman commander defeated barbarian groups and freed many prisoners. Later, in the early 200s and 70s, Emperor Aurelian celebrated a huge triumph in Rome after defeating the Palmyrene queen Zenobia, something Augustus had failed to do with Cleopatra. In 303, Emperors Diocletian and Maximian held a grand triumph in Rome after their victory over the Persians, showing off captured treasure and royal family members of the enemy. Because emperors didn't spend much time in Rome anymore, these visits became very special and symbolic. In the 4th century, the idea of victory started to blend with Christian beliefs. Emperors began to be seen as champions of Christ, and the cross became an important symbol of victory. But at the same time, Christian emperors removed the altar of victory from the Roman Senate House, breaking away from traditional Roman religious customs. By the 6th century, the traditional image of winged victory on Roman coins was replaced with an angel holding a globe and a cross. Another big change was the open celebration of victory in civil wars. Since these were some of the few clear military successes for emperors in this period, they used them to strengthen their authority by labeling their enemies as traitors or illegitimate rulers. The Arch of Constantine is a famous example. It honors Constantine's defeat of Maxentius, calling him a tyrant. Emperor Constantius II did something similar with statues and inscriptions after beating Magnentius. Theodosius I also raised an obelisk in Constantinople to celebrate his victory over Magnus Maximus and his son. In 400, a column decorated with Christian symbols was built in Constantinople to mark the defeat of Gainas, a Roman general who turned against the Emperor Arcadius. Even though this was technically a civil war, Gainas and his troops were Goths, so the monument may have been seen as celebrating a foreign victory. A similar case was Emperor Anastasius's victory over the Isaurians near the end of the 5th century, another civil war, but against a region seen as wild and rebellious. During late antiquity, the emperor who had the best reason to celebrate traditional military victories was Justinian. His greatest success was defeating the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. Justinian proudly shared news of his victories in many ways in Constantinople. He had a statue of himself on horseback placed in the square near the palace, and a mosaic in the palace entrance showed him as the one winning wars through his general Belisarius, receiving treasure and prisoners from the defeated Vandals and Goths. The most famous event was a triumphal parade in 534, where Belisarius was allowed to take part, a rare honor at the time. This was described as a return to the old Roman ways. Still, Justinian made sure that he was seen as the main hero. Belisarius had to walk on foot and bow down before Justinian in the Hippodrome, right next to the captured Vandal king, Gelimer. Unlike earlier Roman triumphs, there was no final sacrifice to Jupiter. In a later parade, Justinian even stopped at a church instead, showing how much things had changed. But what did Romans do when they lost? Although Rome won most of its wars, it still faced defeats. Even people living in faraway Roman provinces believed that Romans always win. Still, Romans sometimes lost battles, even in their strongest periods. A Roman writer named Lucilius said in the 2nd century BC that while Rome lost many battles, it never lost a whole war, which for them was what truly mattered. History shows several major defeats. The Gauls winning at the river Allia in 390 BC and sacking Rome. Hannibal's huge victory at Cannae in 216 BC. Roman soldiers being slaughtered by Germanic tribes at Arausio in 105 BC, and Crassus being crushed by the Parthians at Carrhae in 53 BC. There were also shameful surrenders, like to the Samnites at the Caudine Forks in 321 BC and to the Numantines in 137 BC. These were just some of many losses Rome faced during the Republic, even while building its empire. Even though Rome is known for its many military victories, it also suffered several defeats, especially during the Principate and late Antiquity. For example, in AD 9, 3 Roman legions under Varus were completely destroyed in Germany. In 62, the Roman commander Paetus had to surrender to the Parthians in Armenia. In 66, Jewish rebels defeated Cestius at Beth Horon. Other defeats included a Roman legion wiped out by the Dacians in 84 or 85, and later, governors of Cappadocia and Syria lost to Parthian forces in the 160s. In late antiquity, big defeats included Emperor Valerian's capture by the Persians in 260, Emperor Julian's death during a Persian campaign in 363, the Goths crushing Emperor Valens at Adrianople in 378, and the failed naval attack on the Vandals in North Africa in 468. These are just some examples. There were many more. So, how did the Romans react to defeat, given how much they valued victory? Their response can be looked at in two ways: how they remembered the loss, and how they explained it. Unlike the Athenians, Romans didn't build monuments or list names of fallen soldiers in the city. But this didn't mean they ignored defeat. Instead, they had a different tradition. When Rome suffered major losses, they added these events to their religious calendar. The idea was not to honor individuals who died, but to show that Rome had suffered a setback and needed to win back the gods' favor. For instance, July 18th was marked as a Black Day on which no official business was done. This remembered the terrible Gallic victory at the river Allia in 390 BC. Another example is June 8th, when a temple was dedicated to good sense, as a reminder of how poor judgment had led to Rome's loss at Lake Trasimene against Hannibal in 217 BC. When explaining defeats, Romans often blamed the commanders. While actual punishments were rare, some generals were held responsible in public opinion. For example, Claudius Pulcher was blamed after a defeat at sea in 249, and Servilius Caepio after a loss at Arausio in 105 BC. Sometimes, the soldiers were blamed too. After the defeat at Cannae, survivors were sent away to Sicily as punishment. In the 100s and 30s, Roman forces in Spain were criticized for their poor performance, which Scipio Aemilianus had to fix before capturing Numantia. Another example is after the battle against Pyrrhus at Heraclea in 280 BC. Both the general and soldiers were forced to spend the winter in tents as a form of discipline. All of this shows how seriously Romans took defeat, always looking for someone to blame and ways to improve. Sometimes, Romans explained military defeat not just by blaming the commander or the soldiers, but by saying that religious rituals had been ignored or done incorrectly. They believed that losing a battle could mean the gods were angry or had withdrawn their support. This shows again how closely religion and war were connected in Roman thinking. For example, some sources say that Claudius Pulcher lost a battle in 249 BC because he ignored bad omens. C. Flaminius was said to have skipped important religious duties before he was killed at the Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217 BC. Crassus also reportedly ignored warnings before beginning his failed Parthian campaign. Even later on, this kind of thinking continued. After hearing about the disaster where Varus lost 3 legions, Augustus promised to hold big games for Jupiter, hoping this would help Rome recover, just like during earlier crises. Another example is Paetus, who went into Armenia even though there were signs of bad luck. His horse got spooked while crossing a river, and an animal escaped before a sacrifice could be made properly. When it came to blaming people for defeat, generals in the Principate period were not usually put on trial, often because they had died in battle, either by the enemy or by suicide. Varus and Severianus killed themselves, and others like Sabinus died in combat. Cestius Gallus died soon after his defeat. But even if they weren't punished officially, these commanders were still criticized after death. Writers like Velleius Paterculus said Varus was a bad general, and another story claimed Severianus only went to fight in Armenia because he listened to a fake prophet. Regular soldiers were less often blamed, but some sources said that Roman troops in Syria in the 160s lost to the Parthians because they had become lazy and spoiled by living in rich eastern cities. This idea, that luxury made Roman soldiers weak, was a common belief, even if it wasn't always true. During the early Roman Empire, defeats rarely happened when the emperor was personally leading the army. This helped protect the emperor from being blamed. While some emperors, like Trajan, led battles themselves, many others, such as Tiberius and Hadrian, chose not to, even if they had military backgrounds. But this changed in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Emperors became more directly involved in military campaigns, which also made them more open to criticism when things went wrong. At the same time, the rise of Christianity introduced new ways of explaining military failures. For example, when Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persians in 260, something that had never happened to an emperor before, Christian writers said it was punishment from God, especially since Valerian had ordered the persecution of Christians a few years earlier. One writer even said he was rightfully defeated. Similarly, Emperor Julian's campaign in Persia and his death were seen by Christians as a result of his return to paganism. Even though Valens was a Christian, his loss at Adrianople was blamed on his support of the Arian branch of Christianity, which many saw as heretical. Not everyone agreed with these Christian views. Some pagan writers, like Libanius, claimed that a Christian Roman soldier killed Julian, and that the gods were angry because Julian's death had not been avenged. Ammianus Marcellinus, a pagan historian who admired Julian, hinted that Julian may have ignored bad omens before invading Persia. Others believed Valens' death was linked to his harsh treatment of pagans, especially during a crackdown in Antioch. In 384, the senator Symmachus asked Emperor Valentinian II to bring back the altar of victory to the Senate House. He argued that abandoning traditional Roman religion would only lead to more defeats by foreign enemies. This view grew stronger among pagans, especially historians like Zosimus and Eunapius, who blamed the empire's military failures on the emperors turning away from the old gods and choosing Christianity instead. In response, Christian thinkers like Augustine wrote major works to defend their faith. Augustine's City of God aimed to prove that Christianity was not the cause of Rome's troubles. His student Orosius also wrote a history to show that the disasters of the pagan past were worse than anything happening in his Christian era. In late antiquity, people didn't just explain military defeats through religion. They also saw human decisions and actions as important causes. For example, even though Christian writers said that Emperor Valerian's defeat in 260 was God's punishment, other explanations existed. The historian Zosimus, who was not a Christian, said that Valerian's army was weakened by a plague and that he tried to make peace with the Persian king, but during negotiations, Shapur betrayed him and took him prisoner. This may have been Zosimus's way of defending Valerian, as other pagan sources simply said Valerian was defeated in war without calling him incompetent. Julian's defeat is harder to understand because there was so much debate about his religious beliefs. But in Valens' case, ancient sources suggest that the emperor, his generals, and even his soldiers were blamed for poor military leadership. Still, since many of them died in the battle, that criticism had little real impact. After Emperor Theodosius I died in 395, emperors rarely led battles themselves. At first, this was because his sons were too young, but it also likely reflected the fear of political chaos, like what happened after the deaths of Julian and Valens in battle. Keeping emperors away from the battlefield helped protect them from being blamed for failure. Instead, blame shifted to the generals. For instance, when the general Belisarius was defeated by the Persians in 531, Emperor Justinian held an investigation and removed him from command. Later, in the same century, several generals were dismissed after losing battles, but they were not put on trial, and many managed to return to important positions. Belisarius, for example, became a hero again the next year by saving Justinian during the Nika riots, and then defeating the Vandals. Others were able to return to power because they were related to the emperor. In this way, removing generals became a useful tool for emperors to avoid taking blame themselves when things went wrong. From early in the Roman Republic, being a soldier and being a citizen were closely connected. One clear sign of this was the structure of the Centuriate Assembly, the group of citizens that voted for top government officials and declared wars. This assembly was actually linked to the Roman army. It was organized like a military unit. The citizens met on the Campus Martius, a field near the Tiber River, where soldiers also trained and were recruited. Citizens were divided into 193 groups called centuries, and these groups determined both their military roles and their voting power. The historian Polybius pointed out that Rome's strength in war came from the fact that its soldiers were citizens who had a personal connection to their land and families. Unlike Carthage, which used hired foreign troops, Rome's citizen soldiers fought harder and stayed committed, even after defeats, because they were defending their own country. Because of this strong link between citizenship and military service, slaves were not allowed to join the army. This rule wasn't new in the empire. It had been around since the Republic. The strongest proof of this rule comes from a rare exception. After the major Roman defeat at the Battle of Cannae, Rome faced a manpower crisis. So, in desperation, they armed 8,000 young, strong slaves, but only after asking each one if they agreed to fight. The government bought them from their owners, and these men, called volones, served bravely. After helping to win the Battle of Beneventum in 214 BC, they were rewarded with their freedom. But this was a one-time solution, not a new policy. Roman beliefs about honor, bravery, and the idea that only free men could truly be courageous were too deeply rooted for slaves to regularly serve in the military. In the early days of the Roman Republic, being born a citizen wasn't enough to join the army. You also had to own property. Until around the late 2nd or early 1st century BC, this rule was strictly followed. Every 5 years, Roman citizens had to report how much property they owned during a census. Although all citizens could vote in the Centuriate Assembly, the system was designed so that wealthy citizens had more power and influence, both in politics and in the army. This made sense back then because the government didn't provide soldiers with weapons or armor. Each man had to buy his own. So the more wealth you had, the more you could contribute to Rome's military, and the more your vote counted. At the very bottom of this system were the proletari, citizens who were too poor to own land or significant property. Their name came from proles, meaning offspring, because their only real value to the state was having children who might serve in the future. They usually didn't serve in the legions. Instead, they were often part of the urban poor and were not expected to fight unless Rome faced a serious emergency. In those rare times, they might be armed and sent into battle. Normally, though, their role was to serve as rowers in the navy, which was dangerous during sea wars but seen as much less honorable than being a legionary soldier. Even freed slaves could be rowers, showing how this job was considered lower in status. Overall, the system supported the idea that small landowners, especially farmers, made the best soldiers. This belief was summed up by Cato the Elder, who once said that the bravest and toughest men came from the countryside. In the early and middle Roman Republic, there was a strong connection between being a soldier, being a citizen, and owning land. This made sense because most wars happened close to home, in or near Italy. But things started to change when Rome began expanding overseas and when civil wars broke out near the end of the Republic. During the civil wars of the 40s and 30s BC, powerful leaders like Caesar, Pompey, Antony, and Octavian began recruiting soldiers who weren't Roman citizens. This broke the old rule that only citizens could join the legions, and over time, military service became a way to earn Roman citizenship. At the same time, the link between land ownership and military service also began to weaken. Famous figures like the Gracchi brothers pushed for land reform, and later, Marius allowed even the poor to join the army. For a long time, historians believed that as Rome's armies were sent farther away to places like Spain and the Eastern Mediterranean, it became harder for small farmers to leave their land for long military campaigns. Wealthy Romans, enriched by war, bought up farmland and used captured slaves to work it. As a result, fewer citizens had enough property to qualify for military service, and this supposedly led to a recruitment crisis that Marius solved by letting the landless join the army. This idea was popular because it offered a simple explanation for the fall of the Republic. But it was mostly based on ancient texts, which might have exaggerated the changes. In recent years, archaeologists have done fieldwork in parts of Italy and found that many small farms continued to exist even after these supposed crises. This suggests that the shift wasn't as dramatic as once believed. New studies using inscriptions have also revealed that Roman men usually didn't get married until their late 20s. Since men could be drafted at 17, it was often the sons of small farmers, rather than the farmers themselves, who went to war. This means military service may not have harmed small farms as much as older historians thought. When we look at the bigger picture, Marius' well-known recruitment of landless citizens for his African campaign in 107 BC might not have been as important as people often think. In the years that followed, most soldiers still came from the countryside, not from the poor, jobless people in the cities. No other Roman general is known to have copied Marius' example, which suggests that there was still a good supply of citizens who owned property and were eligible to serve. The historian Sallust noted that the proletari were eager to join Marius because they hoped to gain wealth from war, and some scholars believe Marius only accepted them to gain more support from the common people in Rome. What really weakened the connection between property ownership and military service was the large-scale recruitment during the Social War and the Civil Wars at the end of the Republic, when the need for soldiers was at its peak. One major change was how the army recruited men. Instead of making them come to Rome for selection, officials called conquistadores were sent out across the countryside to find new soldiers. These recruiters probably didn't check if the men owned land, which meant even the poor could be accepted. Still, the idea of the farmer soldier remained strong for many years. In the late 2nd century AD, the philosopher Maximus of Tyre said that farmers made good soldiers because they were used to hard work. Later, in the 4th or 5th century, the military writer Vegetius agreed, saying that people from the countryside were better suited for army life. They were strong, used to living simply, and not spoiled by luxury. In contrast, he thought city workers like bakers or weavers were not fit for war because their jobs were seen as soft or too domestic. It's hard to say how true this ideal was in real life during the empire, but some evidence shows that many recruits came from small landowning families, while other sources suggest that poor country people also joined the army, hoping for a better future. In late antiquity, new soldiers were mostly recruited based on the same system used for collecting land taxes. This meant that almost all recruits came from the countryside, especially from poor, underdeveloped areas like the Balkans, Isauria, and Armenia. These regions, lacking large cities, were seen as the best places to find new soldiers. One famous example is Justin I, who later became emperor. In the mid-400s, he and 2 other poor peasants from Illyria joined the army because they lived in poverty and hardship at home. Still, even though rural people were seen as good material for soldiers, training was important. Procopius described how a group of farmers from central Anatolia suffered in battle because they had just left farm life and weren't ready for war. Once these men joined the army, they left their farming life behind, often for 20 years or more, since military service became a full-time job. In fact, soldiers weren't allowed to buy land in the provinces where they were serving, so they wouldn't get distracted by farming. But they could still inherit or rent land, and others like family members or hired workers could farm it while they were away. There's some written proof that this happened in late antiquity. There was also a special group of soldiers called limitanae who guarded the empire's frontiers between the 4th and 6th centuries. Some laws from that time mention that these soldiers worked the land and that this land should stay with them. This shows that the state knew farming helped support these troops. Even though some later writers looked down on the limitani and treated them like part-time militia, this view is unfair. These soldiers still got regular pay until the mid-500s, and there's strong evidence that they remained capable fighters. Just like the farmer soldiers of the early Republic, they proved that soldiers involved in farming could still be very effective. So even if some late Roman soldiers farmed during their service, it doesn't mean the army was falling apart. After the end of the Republic, being a Roman citizen still remained very important for anyone who wanted to serve in the legions. During the Principate, soldiers had to prove they were freeborn Roman citizens. In some official documents from that time, new recruits clearly stated that they were Roman citizens and had the right to join the legion. Slaves were not allowed to serve in the army, and there are several strong examples of this rule. For instance, in the early 2nd century, Emperor Trajan told Pliny the Younger that 2 slaves who had tried to join the army should be punished with death if they had done it without their master's permission. This showed just how seriously the Romans still took the rule. Of course, there were rare exceptions. In major crises, like after the disaster in which 3 legions were wiped out under Varus, Augustus allowed slaves to be recruited, but only after they had been set free first. Even though the empire was much bigger during the Principate, covering the entire Mediterranean region, the citizenship requirement limited who could join the legions. At least in the 1st century AD, more and more, the army began to recruit the descendants of people who had been given Roman citizenship during the late Republic, especially from Western provinces. This was partly because people from Italy didn't want to serve far from home, often at dangerous frontiers like the Rhine, the Danube, or Syria. So, although the ideal of the citizen soldier was still respected, the people filling that role were becoming more culturally diverse. In the eastern provinces, where fewer people were Roman citizens, the legions sometimes recruited non-citizens and gave them citizenship when they joined. Those who weren't citizens could still serve in the auxilia, and they were granted Roman citizenship only after completing their service. There are many surviving military diplomas, bronze documents that recorded the granting of citizenship after service, which show how important this reward was, both for the government and the soldiers themselves. Even though the total number of people who got citizenship this way wasn't huge, it still mattered a lot. When Emperor Caracalla gave Roman citizenship to almost all free people in the empire in 212 AD, it might seem like the idea of the citizen soldier was no longer important. However, legal status still mattered in 2 ways. First, this new law did not include slaves, and since slavery remained common in Roman society, the legal background of soldiers was still important. Several laws from the 4th and 6th centuries repeated the ban on slaves joining the army. Other laws also stressed that it was necessary to check whether new recruits were truly freeborn. Still, in times of crisis, like during the invasion of Italy in 406, the government allowed slaves to join the army in exchange for freedom and money, though they still preferred freeborn men, who were seen as more loyal to Rome. Second, even after Caracalla's law, some freeborn people who were not registered as Roman citizens still existed, likely because some officials didn't properly record all new citizens. In the mid-4th century, Emperor Julian mentioned that his army included both citizens and foreigners. His troops had recruits from areas beyond the Rhine River, and this fits with the general pattern in the 4th century, where Roman emperors began to recruit many barbarians. Some of these people were from defeated groups that had been allowed to settle inside the empire in exchange for military service. These people likely didn't have full Roman citizenship at first. Others came from outside the empire on their own, and sometimes rose to high military positions. Even though ancient sources don't clearly say whether these successful foreigners officially became citizens, it's hard to believe they weren't given citizenship, especially since some became top generals or even consuls. Over time, the difference between citizens and freeborn non-citizens seems to have faded away. It wasn't necessarily because they went through a formal citizenship process, but because they lived as Romans, followed Roman laws, and were accepted as part of the system. In fact, in a letter between two officers in the early 500s about whether someone could join the army, there was no mention of citizenship at all, showing that by then, being a citizen was more about how you lived than your legal paperwork. The Greek historian Polybius once said that courage was the most important virtue in any state, but especially in Rome. He also explained that Roman funeral ceremonies, which celebrated the bravery of the dead and their ancestors, inspired young men to be willing to suffer and even die for the good of the Republic, hoping to win glory. For him, courage was a key reason behind Rome's military strength during the Republic. In Latin, several words could mean courage, like audacia, fortitudo, and animus, but the word virtus was seen as the best one, especially since it came from vir, meaning man. This shows how courage was considered a manly quality, just like the Greek word andreia. Virtus was strongly connected to military skill, and over time it was even treated like a goddess. A Roman general named Marcellus promised to build a temple for Honos and Virtus after he beat the Gauls in battle in 222 BC and killed their leader himself. Later, other generals followed this tradition. Scipio Aemilianus built a shrine to Virtus after taking Carthage in 146 BC. Marius built a temple after defeating the Cimbri in 101 BC, and Pompey added a shrine to Virtus in his theater to celebrate his victories in the East. For the Roman elite, showing courage was extremely important. A good example is Cato the Elder. As a young man, instead of bragging about legal victories, he preferred to show the scars on the front of his body from battles. Another example is the young Scipio Nasica, who led a dangerous night raid in 168 BC and killed an enemy with a spear. These stories show how young Roman nobles tried to prove their bravery early in their careers, often when serving as military tribunes or cavalry officers. The best way to show this courage was often through single combat, fighting one-on-one with an enemy in front of everyone. Polybius wrote that many young Romans had volunteered for such fights to decide the outcome of battles. These one-on-one duels seem to have happened fairly often during the Republic. One noble from the 2nd century BC even claimed he had fought 23 enemies in single combat and won every time, taking their weapons as trophies and getting scars on his front side, never his back. Still, soldiers had to get their commander's permission to fight like this, so not everyone could do it whenever they wanted. This shows that while bravery was honored, it was also carefully controlled within the army. Ordinary Roman soldiers during the Republic could show courage in many ways during battle. One of the most basic was simply holding their ground and staying in formation, especially in the front lines where the fighting was hand-to-hand and extremely dangerous. A powerful example comes from the battle near Pistoria in 62 BC, where the historian Sallust described how Catiline's defeated soldiers died exactly where they stood, showing how bravely they had fought. But Roman soldiers could also be brave in a more active way. by attacking fearlessly. For instance, Scipio's men climbed the walls of New Carthage with no hesitation, and Caesar's troops rushed at the Germans so quickly that they didn't even have time to throw their javelins first. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar's soldiers charged first, while Pompey's men held their ground and responded bravely when attacked. The Roman army also encouraged soldiers to perform heroic acts by giving out dona militaria, special military rewards. These included things like golden crowns for the first man to climb a city wall. The historian Polybius said these awards helped inspire young soldiers to face danger and try to outdo each other in battle. While early on, only a few types of awards existed and were given for specific acts like wounding or killing an enemy. Later on, the kinds of rewards and situations for earning them became more varied. Ordinary soldiers, not just officers, could win these honors. For example, during the siege of New Carthage, Scipio promised gold crowns and other prizes to soldiers who showed great bravery, which got the troops excited and motivated. These rewards weren't just for morale. They were also important symbols. Soldiers who won them got special treatment, like leading spots in religious parades. They also proudly displayed their decorations in their homes, especially in the room where they welcomed guests. This shows how much Roman society respected courage. In fact, there were even debates about which soldier had shown the most bravery in history. One famous example was L. Siccius Dentatus, known as the Roman Achilles, who was said to have fought in many one-on-one battles, had 45 scars on the front of his body, and won a huge number of military awards. Stories like his made courage a key part of what it meant to be a Roman soldier. When Roman soldiers showed bravery in battle, they could gain personal glory and admiration. But there was also a risk. If too many soldiers focused on their own heroism, it might harm the unity and organization of the army. Still, in reality, individual acts of courage rarely caused big problems, likely because most of these actions came from soldiers at the front, like skirmishers or cavalry, who had more freedom to act on their own. In fact, these bold actions could even boost the morale of the rest of the army, encouraging a more aggressive and confident attitude in battle. The key was finding a good balance between personal bravery and loyalty to the group, and between taking initiative and following orders. However, another part of Roman military discipline could clash with the idea of manly courage: the use of physical punishment. Soldiers could be beaten if they made mistakes like falling behind on a march or losing their weapons. This was a problem because, in Roman society, being beaten was usually something only slaves experienced. So punishing free Roman citizens this way felt wrong to many and could cause unrest, as seen in the soldier mutinies early in Emperor Tiberius's rule. Some historians think that one way Romans tried to deal with this contradiction was by giving a different meaning to wounds received in battle. While scars from beatings were seen as shameful, wounds on the front of the body earned respect and proved a soldier's bravery. These battle scars became a symbol of manhood and honor, showing that the soldier had faced the enemy head-on and fulfilled his duty with courage. During the Principate period, the idea of courage, or virtus, changed in some important ways. It became strongly connected to the emperor, starting with Augustus, who included it on his golden shield in the Senate House. On coins and other symbols, virtus was used to show the emperor's strength and loyalty to Rome. While it still meant bravery in war, it also came to mean serving the state faithfully. As fewer opportunities remained for aristocrats to win glory in battle, some philosophers, especially the Stoics, started to think about virtues in ways that didn't involve fighting. Also, the old tradition of formal single combat disappeared, and military awards were more often given to officers rather than ordinary soldiers. Still, bravery in battle was important. The word virtus shows up on many soldier gravestones, and stories from the early empire tell of soldiers who fought bravely. For example, during the Jewish revolt around 70 AD, a cavalryman named Longinus ran into enemy lines, killed 2 men, and made it back safely. Another soldier, Marcus Valerius Maximianus, was praised on his tomb for killing a barbarian leader with his own hands. But interestingly, both of these examples come from cavalry units. And even though Longinus's courage inspired others, his commander Titus told his men not to take such risks. He wanted them to show their bravery in safer, more disciplined ways. This shows that while individual heroism was still admired, it had to fit within the controlled, professional style of the Roman army during the empire. In late antiquity, as emperors became more directly involved in battles, especially in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the idea of virtus, meaning bravery or courage, became even more closely tied to them. Writers of the time, like Menander Rhetor, said that military courage was the most important quality an emperor could have. Speeches praising emperors often focused on their bravery in war. For example, Constantine was praised for fighting bravely, even in single combat, and inscriptions honored him and other emperors for their courage and victories. Constantius II was also praised for leading battles against the Persians with great bravery. The historian Ammianus described Emperor Julian's strength by telling how he fought in the front lines, withstood extreme conditions, and sometimes even physically stopped his soldiers from running away in battle. Old heroic ideals from the Roman Republic were still remembered. Ammianus mentioned famous Roman heroes like Marcellus and Siccius Dentatus. In 359, some officers who led a risky night attack during the siege of Amida were honored with statues in full armor. When some soldiers fled during the Battle of Strasbourg, Julian punished them by making them wear women's clothing and walk through the camp. This humiliation made them fight even more bravely later on to regain their honor. There are also signs that formal single combat might have returned in this period, but it wasn't very common. Most of the known stories come from the historian Procopius, who may have made them more dramatic on purpose, especially since many of the fighters came from different cultural backgrounds and were often cavalry officers. Overall, while the idea of courage remained important, how it was shown and celebrated changed over time. The words Andrea and virtus both originally meant courage, but they also come from words meaning man, which shows how strongly the idea of bravery was tied to masculinity in Roman and Greek culture. This makes it interesting to think about how women were seen when they took part in war or military roles. The Roman historian Tacitus shows that elite Roman men were uncomfortable with women being involved in military matters. For example, he criticized Agrippina the Elder for acting like a general on the Rhine frontier in AD 15, and he disapproved of Plancina, the wife of a governor, for taking part in military training exercises. In this kind of social environment, it's not surprising that the only women who were spoken about positively in military roles were not Roman. They were outsiders like Boudica, Zenobia, and Mavia, women from the edges of the empire. Even in archaeology, there may be signs of this idea. Some Roman helmets have masks showing female faces, which might reflect themes from Amazon legends or Eastern cultures, both seen as foreign and exotic by Romans. Throughout Roman history, new weapons, armor, and siege machines did improve how wars were fought. But there was never a major invention that completely changed warfare, like gunpowder or airplanes did in later times. In Rome, the key to winning wars was having enough soldiers. So how the Roman state got people to join the army was extremely important. To gather enough men, the government often used force, meaning they had to use conscription or mandatory military service. In the Republic, the recruitment process was called the delectus, which literally means choice, but it wasn't voluntary for the people selected. officials chose men from those who were legally required to serve, and they had no say in the matter. At first, only citizens who owned a certain amount of property were allowed to join the army, and the poorest citizens were left out. Even among those eligible, only men between 17 and 45 were regularly recruited, while older men between 46 and 60 were called up only in emergencies. In theory, young men were supposed to serve for 16 years, but usually they could leave after 6 years, unless there was a major war, like the one against Hannibal. In the early Republic, the selection happened in Rome. But as people spread across Italy, local officials had to help with recruitment. By the 1st century BC, those living near Rome were gathered at a field called the Campus Martius, while recruiters were sent to the countryside to find more soldiers. Many stories tell us that this system was enforced by punishment. People who tried to avoid service could be fined, whipped, exiled, or even sold into slavery. There were also moments when large groups of people resisted joining the army, especially when wars seemed hard or unlikely to bring rewards. Spanish campaigns, for example, were unpopular. But these cases were exceptions. Most eligible citizens accepted their duty. It was only at the end of the Republic, during the Social War and the Civil Wars that followed, when the state became more aggressive in forcing people into the army, using recruiters to actively hunt down those who could be drafted. In addition to force, Rome also used soft power to recruit soldiers during the Republic, especially through personal connections and favors. Powerful leaders, like the consuls, could let certain people avoid military service even if they didn't have a legal reason. Sometimes tribunes of the plebs pressured consuls to grant these exemptions. Generals also relied on their personal networks to gather troops. For example, Scipio Aemilianus raised an army of 4,000 men for a campaign in Spain in 134 BC, many of whom were his friends or clients. Similarly, Pompey used his family's estates and connections in Picenum to raise an army in the 80s BC. Later, when Augustus transformed Rome's part-time citizen army into a professional standing army, this changed the way soldiers were recruited. Instead of creating new legions every time there was a need, the army now moved existing troops to where they were needed most. The pressure to find new soldiers became less intense compared to the final years of the Republic, and since the military now offered stable, paid employment with a reward at the end, more people were willing to join voluntarily. Over time, most of these new recruits came from outside Italy, showing that forced recruitment, or conscription, was no longer widely used in the Italian heartland. Even though volunteer soldiers became more common over time, this doesn't mean that conscription, forcing people to join the army, was completely abandoned. All Roman citizens were technically still required to serve in the military, and we have some evidence that conscription was still used, especially during the 1st century. Later on, in the time of Emperor Septimius Severus, military service became more attractive because soldiers' pay increased and most recruits were stationed close to home. These changes made volunteering more popular. However, in the provinces, especially for the auxiliary troops, conscription remained more common. For example, forced military service helped trigger revolts in Dalmatia in AD 6, Thrace in AD 26, and Batavia in AD 69. Rome also learned that they could get soldiers more easily by working with local leaders in the provinces who helped supply troops. In the mid-3rd century, new threats and civil wars increased the need for more soldiers, which likely led to more forced recruitment, even if we don't have much direct evidence from that time. When we do get better records, around the time of Emperor Diocletian, we see that conscription was very important again. Landowners had to supply soldiers based on the size of their land. If they had small farms, they were grouped with others to meet the quota. Sometimes, instead of men, landowners could pay a special tax called recruit gold. But this decision came from the government, not the landowners themselves. This system had problems. Some landowners sent people they didn't want around, probably poor workers or troublemakers, so they weren't ideal soldiers. Military service was so unpopular that new recruits were tattooed, and in some cases, force was used to get them into the army. Some people even injured themselves, especially by cutting off a thumb, just to avoid being recruited. There were so many cases like this that the emperors had to make new laws to stop it. Another sign of how much the Roman Empire needed soldiers was a rule introduced under Emperor Diocletian, which required the sons of soldiers to also join the army when they became adults. Before this, many sons of soldiers had joined the military willingly. This is seen in documents that described them as being from the camp, but now it became an obligation. This system made sense for the government. These young men had grown up around soldiers, were used to army life, and could be easily tracked since they were registered with their father's units from a young age. Some historians have thought that by the late 5th century, when the empire had shrunk to just the eastern half, conscription became less necessary and more men volunteered. But this idea mostly comes from the fact that legal sources stop mentioning conscription, which may just mean they assumed it was still happening like before. Other small pieces of evidence from the late 6th century show that forced recruitment likely continued. So how many soldiers did Rome actually have at different times? That's an important question because it shows how well the state could gather men for war, and how much that affected the general population. It also helps us understand how big campaigns were and whether Rome could manage the logistics. In the Middle and Late Republic, Rome got most of its soldiers from Italy, from both Roman citizens and allied communities. But as Rome expanded, it also started using more non-Italian troops, known as auxilia, which became more important than people usually realize. When looking at Roman citizens, we can see some patterns. In the 3rd century BC, before the Hannibalic War, Rome usually raised 4 legions per year, 2 for each consul, meaning about 18,000 soldiers. But during the Hannibalic War, this number grew rapidly. From 214 BC onwards, Rome raised more than 20 legions yearly, and in 212 BC, they raised 25 legions, the highest number. In the early 2nd century BC, the average dropped to around 10 legions per year, since Rome had regular wars in Spain, northern Italy, and the eastern regions. In the second half of that century, the number dropped even more, except during major threats like the wars with the Cimbri and Teutones. In the 1st century BC, the number of legions rose again during wars like those against Sertorius, Mithridates, and Caesar's campaigns in Gaul. During the civil wars at the end of the Republic, the number exploded, possibly reaching 60 legions by the Battle of Actium. However, these big numbers don't tell the whole story. After the Social War in the 80s BC, Rome gave citizenship to many Italian allies, which greatly expanded the pool of people eligible to fight. So even though the civil wars put a heavy burden on the citizen population, it probably wasn't worse than during the Hannibalic War, and maybe even easier to manage because the population had grown over time. These numbers show that during the Roman Republic, the state could gather a much larger number of soldiers when it faced serious threats. But that leads to another important question. What percentage of the total citizen population did these soldiers actually represent? This is a hard question to answer for 2 main reasons. First, ancient sources don't agree on how many men were in a legion. Sometimes they say 4,000, sometimes 6,000. Second, we don't know the exact size of the Roman citizen population during the Republic. We do have some census records, but historians disagree on how to interpret them. For example, one census taken around 70 to 69 BC says there were less than 1 million citizens, while another taken in 28 BC lists over 4 million. Some scholars, like Peter Brunt, believe the earlier numbers counted only adult males, while the later number also included women and children. Based on this idea, the real number of adult male citizens in 28 BC would be closer to 1.7 million. This idea is known as the low count. Others, like Elio Locascio, argue that the later census still counted only adult males, giving us the high count. Most experts lean toward the low count, but there's also a middle count approach that tries to find a balance. Using the low count, historians estimate that during the Hannibalic War in 212 BC, about 29% of adult male citizens were serving in the army. That's a very high number, but not impossible. If you include women and children in the total population, then about 12.6% of all Roman citizens were in the army at that time. That's similar to the Confederate States' military participation during the American Civil War in the 1860s. Even if we use the high count, we still get a rate of about 6.4%, which is similar to the military recruitment rates in countries like Prussia and Sweden in the 1700s. So no matter how we read the numbers, we can say that Rome was able to recruit huge numbers of soldiers during emergencies, like the Hannibalic War or the Social War, more than many European countries managed even centuries later. While Rome probably couldn't keep up those high numbers for many years, it clearly had the ability to respond with massive manpower in times of crisis. During the Principate, the way Rome managed its army and manpower changed a lot compared to the Republic. First, the people of Italy began to play a smaller role in army recruitment, while more soldiers started to come from the provinces, regions outside of Italy, which had much larger populations. Sometimes even people from beyond Rome's borders were used. Second, when Augustus created a permanent, full-time army, it meant that the number of soldiers stayed more stable over time, although sometimes it changed when legions were lost or new ones were added to protect new provinces. For example, when Augustus died in AD 14, there were 25 legions. By the time of Emperor Septimius Severus, nearly 200 years later, this number had grown to 33 because the empire had expanded into new regions like Britain, Arabia, Dacia, and Mesopotamia, places that needed defending but also provided new soldiers. Historians estimate that the Roman army during this period had between 400,000 and 500,000 soldiers. The exact number depends on things like when we measure it, how big we think each legion was, and how many auxiliary troops there were compared to legionaries. Most experts agree the number was around 400,000. Now, when we compare that number to the total population of the Roman Empire, which was probably around 50 million in Augustus's time, and maybe 60 million by the middle of the 2nd century, the army made up less than 1% of the population. But since only men could be soldiers, and we have to exclude women, children, and the elderly, the percentage of eligible men in the army was probably closer to 2% or a bit more, depending on how we guess mortality rates. Even at its largest, this was not a huge burden on the empire's population. In fact, compared to earlier times like the Republic, when military service was more widespread and intense during major wars, the Principate's standing army was relatively light in terms of manpower demands. In late antiquity, most historians agree that the Roman army grew in size during the 4th century, possibly reaching around 500,000 to 600,000 soldiers. If we compare this to the 2nd century, when the army was about 400,000 strong, it shows an increase of about 25%. You might expect this to have put more pressure on the empire's manpower, especially since the population had suffered from serious plagues in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But even with these challenges, and although population growth probably resumed in the 4th century, most studies suggest that recruiting soldiers was still manageable and didn't overwhelm the population. Even a major plague in the 6th century didn't seem to hurt recruitment much, perhaps because it mainly affected city dwellers, while the army mostly recruited from the countryside. The real problem with manpower came when many soldiers were lost in battle, which happened more often in late antiquity. In those cases, it was hard to replace experienced troops quickly. Another important topic is the size of armies sent out on specific campaigns. These numbers help us understand how well the Roman state could organize and supply its forces. While massive armies were sometimes formed, like the 70,000 to 80,000 who fought Hannibal at Cannae, more common were armies of 25,000 to 30,000 men, especially during the Middle Republic. In the Late Republic, Crassus went to fight the Parthians with about 45,000 men, and Caesar had a similar number at the Siege of Alesia. Under the emperors, some large armies were raised, such as 100,000 men against Maroboduus in AD 6, or Trajan's invasion of Dacia in 105. In the 4th century, Julian led 65,000 soldiers into Persia, and in the 6th century, Anastasius sent an army of 52,000 to defend Mesopotamia. Armies of around 50,000 were quite large for pre-modern Europe and show how organized the Roman military system was. They were mostly infantry, which were easier to supply than cavalry. Still, the fact that armies bigger than 50,000 were rare shows that there were limits to what the Roman state could handle. In the early days of Rome, soldiers had to pay for their own equipment, and there was no regular salary for military service. Since battles were usually close to home, this system worked for a while. Every citizen was expected to bring his own armor and weapons based on how rich he was, which was checked through regular censuses. But as Rome started fighting wars farther away and for longer periods, a daily payment called stipendium was introduced to cover living costs. Some ancient sources say this began around 406 BC, during a war with the Etruscans. But since Rome didn't use coins at that time, this date is uncertain. It may have actually started during the Samnite Wars a bit later. What's clear is that this payment was connected to a new tax on property called the tributum, which helped fund the army. Over time, the cost of paying soldiers increased greatly. For example, one estimate says that in the early 2nd century BC, Rome spent about 228 million denarii on the stipendium, and by the early 1st century BC, that amount had risen to 968 million. This rise was because more legions were fighting, especially during the Social War and the Civil Wars, and because Rome now had to pay not only its own soldiers, but also those from allied cities. When all military expenses were added up, they took up about 60% of the state's income in the early 2nd century BC and 65% in the early 1st century BC. Even though the spending went up a lot, Rome also gained wealth through victories, which helped balance the cost. For example, after defeating the Macedonians in 167 BC, Rome took over their royal treasury, which allowed them to stop collecting the tributum tax for a while. That tax wasn't brought back during the rest of the 2nd century, probably because new provinces brought in enough money through taxes, and the elite preferred not to rely on ordinary citizens when making decisions about war. Later, Emperor Augustus created a permanent standing army, which came with a big financial cost. One major cost was the retirement bonus he promised: 12,000 sesterti for regular soldiers and 20,000 for the elite praetorians. At first, soldiers received land and some money when they retired, but giving land became hard without taking it away from others, which caused political problems. So in 13 BC, Augustus began giving only money, and he paid for it himself at first. But by AD 6, he realized he couldn't keep doing that forever, so he created a special military treasury called the Aerarium Militare. He put some of his own money in it, but most of the funding came from new taxes, a 5% tax on inheritances and a 1% tax on auction sales, especially of land. These taxes weren't popular, especially among the wealthy, but the system lasted until the early 3rd century. It's not easy to figure out exactly how much the Roman Empire spent on its army after it became a permanent, standing force. Some things are known, like the yearly pay for legionaries, 900 sestertii during Augustus's time, later increased to 1,200 by Domitian in 84 AD. We also have a fairly good idea of how many men were in a legion, usually between 5,000 and 5,500. But there are many other unknowns, such as how many support troops there were, how much they were paid, whether military units were fully staffed or under strength, how much officers earned, and how many soldiers lived long enough to receive their retirement bonus. Because of all these uncertainties, historians give different estimates for the army's total yearly cost in the 1st century, ranging from 370 million sestertii to around 500 million. These numbers also need to be compared to the total money available to the emperor each year, which is even harder to estimate. Scholars think the imperial budget might have been somewhere between 670 and 900 million sestertii. So, depending on which figures you use, the army may have taken up anywhere from 25% to 75% of the whole budget. But most likely, it was somewhere on the lower end of that range. One reason for this is that, while army pay provided a steady income and made military service attractive, it wasn't especially generous, especially after subtracting costs like food and equipment. Also, since the state could still draft people into the army, it didn't need to offer high pay. Taxes during the Principate were also low, probably under 10%, so the empire couldn't afford to be too generous with military spending. On top of that, emperors had other major expenses, like funding food for the people of Rome, putting on public entertainment, and building projects. Later emperors like Septimius Severus and his son Caracalla raised army pay, and by the end of the 2nd century, there were more legions and auxiliary troops than before. So, logically, the army should have cost more. But the empire also brought in more money thanks to new provinces like Arabia, Dacia, and Mesopotamia, and economic growth during this time likely helped cover the extra military spending. In the mid-3rd century, the Roman Empire faced more frequent wars on different fronts and began losing control of some provinces, either temporarily or permanently, like Dacia. At the same time, inflation made things worse. These problems forced the government to change how it funded the army. During this crisis, they started collecting taxes in kind, meaning goods like grain instead of money. Later, Emperor Diocletian turned this into a more organized system called the Annona, which focused on collecting food supplies, especially grain. Although this system slowly returned to money-based taxes in the 5th century, the chaos of the 3rd century and the introduction of new coinage in the 4th century, like the gold solidus, make it hard to compare the military budget of late antiquity with that of earlier times. The army in the 4th century was probably larger, possibly around 500,000 to 600,000 soldiers, though historians disagree about the exact numbers. However, this bigger army might have been balanced out by lower pay. In late antiquity, emperors more often gave special money gifts, called donatives, especially when they took power or celebrated important anniversaries. These gifts added to the cost of ruling. On the other hand, bonuses given to soldiers when they retired may have become less important. The special military treasury disappeared in the early 3rd century, maybe because of Diocletian's reforms, or because money bonuses weren't as common anymore. In the 4th century, retired soldiers were more often rewarded with land instead of money. More importantly, many veterans were given tax exemptions or reductions, which helped them without the state having to spend actual money. Just like in earlier periods, we don't have clear records of how much the army cost during late antiquity. Estimates vary a lot. Some say the military used up about 2/3 of the empire's budget, while others say it was more like 1/3 or half. Even though ancient sources often complain about high taxes, these complaints might be exaggerated. Still, it's clear that taxes were higher than during the earlier low-tax system of the Principate. This increase was likely due to the growing military problems the empire had to deal with. Finally, when thinking about the financial benefits of war, Roman victories brought wealth in 2 ways. First, they gained quick profits by seizing valuables. Second, they took land, which could provide long-term income. The rest of this section looks at how these 2 benefits of war stayed the same or changed over time in Roman history. One of the quickest ways Rome made money from war was by taking loot, also known as booty. But another important short-term gain came from indemnities, payments that defeated enemies were forced to make, especially during the middle years of the Roman Republic. 2 of the biggest examples are Carthage, which had to pay 10,000 talents of silver after losing the war against Hannibal, and Antiochus III, who paid 15,000 talents after being defeated in 188 BC. Carthage's payments were stretched over 50 years as a way to keep them under control, but Antiochus had to pay in a much shorter time. By the 3rd century, Rome had already collected at least 4,675 talents from enemies, and thanks to these large payments, the total in the first half of the 2nd century BC reached at least 27,280 talents. This extra money allowed Roman officials, like the censors, to fund massive building projects in the city, something they hadn't been able to do before. Later, indemnities became less common, but there were still exceptions. For example, in the 80s BC, the general Sulla made Mithridates pay 2,000 talents and also forced cities in Asia that had helped Mithridates to pay a total of 20,000 talents. To understand how big these sums were, it helps to compare them to Roman expenses. Keeping one legion active for a year in the 2nd century BC cost about 100 talents, and even the very expensive Martian aqueduct, built in the 140 BC, cost 7,500 talents. While indemnities were mostly a feature of the mid-Republic, booty was always a part of Roman warfare. The amount varied, and we don't always have solid numbers, but some records from victory celebrations tell us about huge amounts of gold and silver taken from enemies, sometimes more than 500 talents. Rome also made money by capturing people and selling them as slaves. For example, after defeating Epirus in 167 BC, the Romans enslaved 150,000 people. Even using low-price estimates, that would bring in at least 1,700 talents. Rome also took valuable items like temple treasures or government reserves, which had just been sitting unused, and brought them back into circulation. Not all this wealth went to the state. Generals gave rewards to their soldiers and kept a small share for themselves, maybe around 5%. Still, a lot of the treasure ended up in the Roman treasury. The money was used to fund more military campaigns, but it also helped grow the Roman economy. Thanks to this extra wealth, there was more trade and production during the later years of the Republic. During the Principate, big amounts of loot from wars became less common because most of Rome's enemies weren't as rich as Carthage or the Hellenistic kingdoms they had fought earlier. Still, there were some major exceptions. For example, after crushing the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, the Romans took enough treasure to help build the Colosseum. Similarly, Emperor Trajan used the wealth from his victory over Dacia to fund the building of his Grand Forum in Rome. Even though material riches were harder to come by, capturing people was still very common. One source says that 97,000 prisoners were taken during the Jewish War, and many other records show that war remained a major way Rome gained slaves during this period. The same continued in late antiquity. Roman armies were still able to take many captives and seize valuable loot, especially when they managed to capture the Persian king's baggage trains, or when the general Belisarius took the treasure of the Vandals and Goths in 534 and 540. However, these victories were balanced out by Roman citizens themselves being captured and enslaved by invading Persians and barbarian groups who also took plenty of valuables. In the 5th and 6th centuries, Roman rulers began to regularly pay off enemies like the Persians, Goths, Huns, and Avars with large sums of money to keep peace. These payments, often called subsidies or diplomatic gifts, were criticized at the time because they made Rome look weak. But in reality, they were often cheaper than going to war or losing a battle. In a way, they were the opposite of the old indemnities that Rome used to demand from its defeated enemies. When it comes to gaining long-term resources, Rome made major progress during the Middle Republican period. As they conquered Italy, the Roman state took over large areas of land from defeated enemies, and later also from former allies who had turned against Rome during the Hannibalic War. Some of this land was given to Roman citizens or used to set up colonies, which helped regular Romans benefit directly from war. These lands also brought in some tax money, but a lot of the land remained public property, ager publicus, which Rome allowed Italian allies to keep farming if they paid rent or pasture fees. This helped keep the allies loyal to Rome, at least until the end of the 2nd century BC. Rome also began gaining valuable land and resources outside of Italy. This included whole provinces, as well as specific assets like mines. One of the biggest financial wins was when Rome gained control of silver mines in Spain in the early 2nd century BC. These mines were worked on a large scale, and even modern research, like studies of ancient pollution found in Arctic ice, confirms how heavily they were used. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Spanish mines were producing around 1,500 talents of silver every year, along with gold and silver from mines in Macedonia. Tax income from the provinces was another major benefit, though it's hard to get exact numbers for how much Rome earned during the Republic. Rome started collecting taxes from Sicily and Sardinia by the late 3rd century, and then from Spain in the early 2nd century. But the real turning point came when Rome took over the wealthy province of Asia in the late 100s BC. This led to more organized and systematic taxation. By the 60s BC, after Pompey's conquests in the east, the empire may have been earning as much as 135 million denarii each year. This wealth even allowed Rome to cancel harbor taxes across Italy. Still, much of this income went to rich elites rather than directly to the state. When Egypt was added to the empire in 30 BC, it became a hugely valuable economic asset because of its incredibly fertile farmland. After that, Rome didn't expand much more. One of the few important later additions was Dacia in the early 2nd century AD, which was rich in gold. During the Principate, the government tried to improve the way mines were managed to increase profits, often by leasing them out to private companies, even though this meant most revenue came through these private operations. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire lost very little land permanently, only Dacia and a part of Germany near the Black Forest. Because of this, the empire was still able to recover and grow strong again in the 4th century. One key reason the eastern part of the empire lasted much longer was that it held on to Egypt until the early 7th century, and Egypt was one of the most important sources of food and taxes. On the other hand, the Western Empire suffered a major blow when it lost North Africa to the Vandals in the 430s. Even though Western emperors tried several times to win it back, they failed. Without the rich tax income from North Africa, the Western government struggled to afford a strong army, which made it even harder to fix the situation. Later, in the 530s and 550s, Emperor Justinian managed to conquer North Africa and Italy again. In theory, these victories could have greatly helped the empire's finances. But most historians think the economic benefits were limited, because the wars, especially the long and brutal fighting in Italy, caused a lot of damage, and North Africa remained unstable even after it was retaken. Looking at the big picture, war affected the Roman economy in different ways, depending on when and where it happened, how long it lasted, and how rich the enemy was. During the Republic, some wars like the Hannibalic War and the Civil Wars badly hurt the economy in Italy. But other wars, especially successful ones against wealthy enemies like the Hellenistic kingdoms or resource-rich areas like Spain, brought in so much wealth that the overall result was positive. These riches helped grow the Roman economy far beyond their original value. However, during the Principate, such big economic gains from war were less common. In the 5th century, the Western Empire lost control over many provinces, and although Justinian later won some of them back, the damage from long wars reduced the possible benefits. Finally, in the early 7th century, the empire suffered even greater economic losses when Egypt and Syria were taken by the Arabs. These events clearly show that while war could bring wealth, it could also cause great economic harm, especially when the fighting dragged on, or when valuable regions were lost for good. The Romans had clear ideas about what made a great general. One famous Roman speaker, Cicero, summed it up in 4 qualities: knowledge of military matters, courage, authority, and good fortune. He said this while supporting Pompey to lead a war in 66 BC. Even though Cicero was trying to promote Pompey, his list gives us a good starting point for understanding what the Romans admired in their commanders. The first quality, military knowledge, didn't mean formal education, because Rome never had a military school for generals. Instead, generals were expected to learn from experience in the field. Pompey, for example, learned by being involved in many campaigns. Even later on, in the 4th century, Emperor Julian was praised for his hands-on skills, like how he set up camps, led troops in battle, and handled sieges. If a general didn't have much experience, he could still be successful by surrounding himself with experienced advisors, as Cicero himself did when he governed Cilicia. The second important quality was courage. But Cicero meant more than just bravery in battle. He also referred to moral strength, like being honest with soldiers, not selling military positions, and making sure troops didn't harm civilians. Still, personal bravery in battle could inspire soldiers. Famous generals like Sulla and Caesar were known for risking their lives to boost morale. For example, Caesar once grabbed a shield and rushed to the front line during a tough battle, and his presence encouraged the soldiers to fight harder. However, taking such risks was dangerous. If a general was wounded or killed, it could lead to panic and defeat. Some people warned against generals fighting on the front lines unless absolutely necessary. One military manual even said that a general should avoid close combat, because if he died, the army could suffer greatly. Even Emperor Constantine was gently criticized for putting himself in danger, and in another case, a general named Philippicus had to be talked out of standing in the front line by his officers. Still, good generals found ways to show courage without taking unnecessary risks. For example, during the siege of New Carthage, Scipio inspected the front lines while protected by bodyguards, and just being visible to his troops gave them energy to fight harder. Similarly, Caesar once ordered all the officers' horses to be sent away before a battle, so everyone would face equal danger, at least in appearance, though he likely stayed at a safer distance himself. These examples show how Roman generals balanced bravery with strategy and self-preservation. Cicero's third quality for a great general was auctoritas, meaning a strong reputation for leadership. In Pompey's case, this meant his long record of military success by the time he was just 40. While it's harder to define this quality clearly, it wasn't limited to the battlefield. In the Roman Republic, auctoritas could also come from success in politics. To become a general, a person first had to win public office, which required speaking well and standing out in both the Senate and public meetings. Some men, like Lucullus, were praised for being skilled speakers both in political and military settings. Those who gained a strong military reputation, such as Pompey, often had the advantage of long-term commands, which gave them time to gain experience and prove themselves. This was also true for Scipio Africanus during the Long War with Hannibal, Marius during the Germanic threat, and Caesar in Gaul. But long commands were unusual since the Republic preferred shorter terms to give more people a chance at military glory. In the Principate, it became harder to separate auctoritas from the emperor himself, as the very title Augustus was linked to this idea of supreme authority. However, in late antiquity, emperors in the 3rd and 4th centuries often came from military backgrounds and earned their power through success on the battlefield. Even in the 5th and 6th centuries, although emperors rarely led armies in person, they or their top generals often had long military careers. Some generals, like Stilicho, Aetius, and Aspar, became powerful political figures mainly because of their military reputation. The fourth and last quality Cicero mentioned was good fortune. While this might sound vague, Romans believed that luck, or divine favor, played a key role in a general's success. Soldiers were more confident and willing to take risks if they believed their commander had a special connection with the gods. For example, Scipio Africanus told his troops that his plan to attack New Carthage came to him in a dream from the sea god Neptune. Sulla claimed he had a dream in which a goddess gave him a thunderbolt to defeat his enemies. Sertorius said that a goddess spoke to him through his pet white deer, and Lucullus was reassured by the goddess Aphrodite in a dream before a battle. Caesar said a divine figure appeared to him before he crossed the Rubicon. Even Augustus once explained his retreat at Philippi as divine protection shown through a dream. These stories may or may not have been true, but they helped generals gain trust and loyalty from their soldiers by making them believe their leader was favored by the gods. Once Rome became a monarchy, it became risky for anyone outside the emperor's family to claim they had divine support. However, in times of civil war, when people were fighting for power, some challengers used stories of dreams or visions to gain legitimacy and inspire their troops. For example, Vespasian claimed to have had a vision in an Egyptian temple in 69 AD, and Septimius Severus said he had dreams showing his rival being defeated. These weren't just to boost morale. They were also meant to convince others that the gods supported their claim to power. In the early 300s, Constantine combined older Roman traditions with Christianity. Before a key battle against Maxentius outside Rome, he said he had a dream or vision of a sign from the Christian god. He had earlier claimed to see the god Apollo promising him victory. His co-emperor, Licinius, also said that before his battle in 313, he had a dream where an angel gave him a prayer to teach his soldiers. Later, Constantius II claimed that a bishop passed him an angelic message that he would win against a rebel. Theodosius I prayed the night before a tough battle in 394, and then said he had a vision of two saints promising victory. While some historians think these stories were added later by Christian writers, it's likely that these leaders really used such stories to boost confidence during critical battles. A good example from a later period is General Philippicus, who inspired his troops before a battle in 586 by showing them an icon of Christ. This act gave the soldiers courage and a sense of divine protection. For such stories or signs from the gods to work, the troops had to hear about them. Generals probably spread the news directly, either by giving speeches or by letting rumors spread through the ranks. But there are doubts about ancient battle speeches. First, historians often made up or heavily edited these speeches to make them sound dramatic or noble. They didn't write down exact words from real events. There was no one recording them at the time, and many soldiers wouldn't have understood the fancy language used in some of these speeches. Second, it's unlikely that a general could be heard by an entire army, especially in large, noisy camps. Still, speeches could be real in certain moments. For instance, in a 6th century battle between the Romans and Persians, a Roman general named Patricius gave a short but powerful speech when his army was trapped with a river behind them. He told his men that it was better to fight and possibly die with honor than to drown while running away. His words gave them courage, and they attacked fiercely, defeating the Persians and even capturing their leaders. This story shows that even if long, dramatic speeches may be fictional, simple, direct words from a general could still make a huge difference in real battles. What makes Patricius's speech especially interesting is that it appears in a text written in Syriac, not in Latin or Greek like most Roman sources. This means it comes from outside the usual Roman cultural traditions and might reflect what a general actually said more accurately, without the influence of classical writing styles. Of course, Patricius probably spoke in Greek or Latin, not Syriac, but the way the speech is recorded is different. It's short, focused on courage and honor, and makes practical sense. He encouraged his soldiers to fight bravely rather than die trying to flee across a dangerous river. The simplicity and directness of this speech are likely due to the urgent situation, and it stands out because it might be closer to a real battlefield speech than the long, dramatic versions found in traditional histories. Another issue is how generals could make themselves heard by large armies. Scholars have discussed different ways this could work. Speeches didn't have to be given right before the battle. They could be made earlier in the day, or even the day before. This would allow officers to repeat the general's message to smaller groups of soldiers. Even if the speech was given just before fighting, a general might ride along the front lines on horseback, repeating short phrases. Gestures could also help deliver the message, since body language was an important part of speaking in ancient times. One useful source that explains this clearly is the Strategicon, a military manual written in the late 6th century and likely backed by the imperial government. This handbook gives detailed advice to generals, dividing instructions into what should be done the day before a battle and on the day itself. It includes a section on giving speeches to encourage troops, saying clearly that this should happen during a break and not all at once to the entire army. Instead, the general should speak to groups of 1,000 to 2,000 men at a time. The speeches should remind soldiers of their past victories and promise rewards from the emperor, as well as thank them for their loyal service. This shows that real battlefield speeches were planned, practical, and designed to motivate through familiar and personal messages, not grand performances for the whole army. Just as important as what a general said was the fact that he was seen by his troops. His physical presence made a strong impression. This idea developed into the image of the general as a commilito, or fellow soldier. Even if he didn't actually fight alongside the soldiers, a general could still connect with them by sharing meals, joining in training, and taking part in hard work. Two early examples of this were Cato the Elder and Marius, both of whom came from less elite backgrounds and made a point of acting like one of the soldiers. As the loyalty of the army became more important during the late Republic, this kind of behavior became more common and expected. After the civil wars, Augustus tried to distance himself from this approach. He made a point of not calling the soldiers commilitones in public speeches to show that he stood above the army and ruled independently. But over time, especially after the Civil War of 68 to 69 AD, emperors began to use such language and gestures again. During the Severan period in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, this became more important. And when Maximinus, a man from a humble background and a career soldier, took power in 235, his image as a true commilito helped him gain support. In the later 3rd and 4th centuries, many emperors came from military backgrounds and led armies in person, so calling themselves fellow soldiers felt natural. It became common in speeches and official statements. Even after emperors stopped leading armies in person after 395, this kind of language didn't fade. It actually increased. Emperors and their advisors realized they needed to maintain a strong connection with the army, even from the palace. Of course, using this language wasn't just about boosting morale. It was also a political strategy to keep the loyalty of the troops. This approach wasn't only used by emperors. Generals in the late Roman world also used it in real military situations. For example, Theodosius the Elder spoke as a commilito during his North African campaign in 375, and Belisarius did the same during his wars in the 530s. These examples show that smart commanders continued to see real value in acting and speaking as one of the troops. In any army, obedience is essential, especially in battle, where soldiers face the risk of death or serious injury. Because this is such a high-stakes situation, armies work hard to make discipline and loyalty a normal part of military life. In modern times, this is often done through repeated drills and uniforms that reduce individuality. In ancient Rome, however, uniforms and drill weren't the main tools for creating discipline. Instead, other practices played a bigger role. One of the most important Roman traditions was the military oath. Every soldier had to swear an oath of loyalty when starting service. During the Republic, this happened each year, since soldiers were selected annually. But during the civil wars of the 1st century BC, when loyalties were often uncertain, generals began asking troops to swear personal oaths to them. Out of this practice came Augustus' idea of having soldiers, and even civilians, swear loyalty directly to him. Under the emperors, the oath was changed to include a promise of loyalty to the ruler and was renewed every year on January 3rd. Although we don't have the exact wording from early periods, a version from the late 4th or early 5th century shows what it likely included: a promise to obey the emperor, never desert the army, and even die for Rome if needed. By that time, the oath also had a Christian element, showing how religion and politics had become connected. Even though not every soldier kept this oath, it still held real importance. The oath was called a sacramentum, which means it had religious weight. Ancient sources say that Romans respected the military oath more than any other, and there's evidence that soldiers even honored the spirit or protective force, the genius of the oath. Alongside the oath, other strategies helped maintain obedience. Rewards for bravery encouraged soldiers to act with courage, and the promise of sharing in war booty was a strong motivator. Most importantly, the hope of receiving land or money after completing their service likely kept many soldiers committed to fulfilling their duties. These combined tools, oath, rewards, and future benefits, helped build a strong culture of loyalty and discipline within the Roman army. Punishments were an important way of enforcing discipline in the Roman army, and some of them were very harsh. The historian Polybius, writing about the army in the 2nd century BC, describes brutal penalties like decimation, where 1 out of every 10 soldiers in a unit was executed, as well as beatings and public humiliation for various offenses, even minor ones. Other ancient sources also mention death penalties for soldiers who disobeyed orders, even in cases where their actions were brave or helpful to Rome. These stories may be exaggerated for dramatic effect, but even if such punishments were real in the early Republic, it seems they were not used as harshly in later periods. For example, after the death of Emperor Augustus in AD 14, several army mutinies broke out. One of the reasons was the soldiers' anger over harsh punishments, especially beatings, which shows that excessive discipline could actually create more problems for the state. Instead of constant threats, discipline was more often maintained by keeping troops busy with useful tasks, like building camps or working on military projects. Still, even with all these systems in place, there were times when soldiers didn't follow the rules. On an individual level, this might mean desertion, either not coming back from leave or sneaking away from camp. Roman law experts clearly saw desertion as a serious issue, and the military tried to control who was allowed to leave and when. But losing a few soldiers here and there was less serious than something bigger, when whole units refused to obey orders. It's important to separate mutiny from full-scale civil war or rebellion. The difference usually came down to who started it. Mutiny was typically sparked by unhappy soldiers rebelling against their officers, while civil wars were usually led by ambitious generals trying to take political power and convincing their soldiers to follow them. Mutiny was just one point on a larger scale of dissatisfaction. Before a full mutiny, soldiers might first complain about problems, such as poor leadership, bad conditions, or unfair treatment. They could do this through their centurions or officers, or even directly to their commander during camp meetings. This gave commanders a chance to fix the situation or explain their decisions. Often, this helped calm things down. But if commanders ignored the complaints or didn't make any changes, frustration could grow until it turned into open rebellion. Modern historians don't fully agree on how many mutinies happened during the Roman Republic. Some say around 40, others say 60. These differences come from how each person defines a mutiny and how reliable they believe early sources are. Still, most agree that mutiny was more common than the popular image of a perfectly disciplined Roman army suggests, especially during the 1st century BC. One of the best documented early examples is a mutiny in 206 BC during the Hannibalic War, when some of Scipio Africanus's troops rebelled at Sucro in Spain. While Scipio's illness may have contributed, the real causes were delays in pay, unfair distribution of loot, long service times, and shortages of supplies. These same issues show up again and again in later mutinies. For example, in 68 BC, Lucullus faced a mutiny in Asia caused by problems with loot, supplies, service length, and tough winter conditions. Caesar also experienced several mutinies. In 58 BC, his soldiers in Gaul were afraid of a strange enemy and lacked food. In 49 BC, his troops at Placentia were upset over late pay, low supplies, and a ban on looting. In 47 BC, the same issues came up again, along with complaints about long service. So, across the Republic, bad service conditions were the main reason soldiers revolted. Commanders sometimes punished those who led the rebellions. Scipio did this at Sucro, and Caesar at Placentia. But more often, they made concessions to calm their troops, even if later writers tried to make it look like the general stayed fully in control. During the Principate, there were far fewer mutinies. This likely has to do with the changes Augustus introduced. He created a permanent standing army that received regular pay and retirement bonuses. These reforms took time to fully work, and they didn't prevent the major mutinies that broke out in AD 14, right after Augustus died. Soldiers in Pannonia and along the Rhine complained about long service, low pay, and harsh discipline. At that time, the new system still had problems. Some soldiers were being kept longer than allowed, probably because the state didn't yet have the funds to pay their retirement bonuses. Even so, the fact that such large-scale mutinies didn't happen again and again during the Principate suggests that the new system gradually began to work. Although pay wasn't generous, the regular structure and long-term benefits gave soldiers more reasons to stay loyal and less reason to revolt compared to earlier times. Mutinies are often seen as a common part of the chaos in the Roman Empire during the mid-3rd century, but it's actually hard to find clear examples of mutiny that aren't better described as civil wars or uprisings tied to power struggles. In many cases, soldiers did kill their commanders or emperors, but this usually happened when they decided to support another person claiming the throne. One case that looks more like earlier Republican-style mutinies happened in 238 AD, when the troops of Emperor Maximinus rebelled during the siege of Aquileia, likely due to food shortages. Another possible example was in 282, when the Emperor Probus was reportedly killed by his soldiers after forcing them to do hard labor, like draining marshes. Still, there are very few clear mutinies in late antiquity until the 6th century. In 536, during the early years of Emperor Justinian's rule, a serious mutiny broke out in North Africa. These were troops who had helped take the region back from the Vandals and were now stationed there. One cause was a delay in paying the soldiers. But there were also new factors not seen in earlier mutinies. The imperial government decided to give land back to families who had lost it during the Vandal conquest, which upset many soldiers who had married Vandal women and now stood to lose that land. On top of that, religious changes caused tension. The Roman state banned Arian Christian services, which affected not just former Vandals, but also some of the Roman soldiers who followed the same faith. The mutiny lasted for nearly 10 years and had to be put down with both force and concessions. Other mutinies in North Africa and Italy around this time also show that delayed pay remained a common and serious problem, mostly because the empire had so many military obligations in different parts of the world. In the eastern regions, there were also mutinies that looked very much like those of the Republic. In 579, a large group of soldiers on the frontier refused to fight until they were fully paid. The Emperor Tiberius II sent a high-ranking official with gold, and the troops returned to duty. Then in 588, new rules about longer service and getting part of their pay in goods instead of money triggered another mutiny in the same area. This one lasted a year and ended only when a bishop helped settle things. The soldiers were pardoned, and the unpopular changes were dropped. The most serious mutiny of all came in 602, when the Danube army rose up and overthrew Emperor Maurus. This wasn't a sudden event. During the 5900s, the same army had already shown signs of rebellion because of poor conditions, but the situation had been managed with compromises and negotiation. Eventually, though, the soldiers' frustration boiled over, leading to a major crisis for the empire. The Mutiny of 602 began when Emperor Maurice once again ordered Roman troops to stay north of the Danube during winter to deal with the threat of Slavic raiders. While there were good military reasons for this, such as the advantage of fighting when the forests were bare and rivers frozen, it meant the soldiers had to operate in very harsh, cold, and uncomfortable conditions. Naturally, the troops were unhappy. much like Lucullus's soldiers had been in similar circumstances back in 68 BC. On top of that, they were also upset about pay, supplies, and lack of loot, problems that had caused many mutinies during the Republic. The soldiers expressed their concerns through representatives to their commander, Peter. But unlike earlier commanders who had managed to calm such tensions, Peter refused to offer any compromise. At the same time, he also failed to punish the leaders of the rebellion, which made things worse. The soldiers eventually took matters into their own hands, marched on Constantinople, and overthrew Maurice, an act that caused serious damage to the empire. Looking at the bigger picture, mutinies in the Roman army happened more often during certain periods. They were especially common in the late Republic and again in the 6th and early 7th centuries. The most common reason was dissatisfaction with conditions of service, delayed pay, long service, or harsh environments. When Augustus created a standing army with regular pay and retirement rewards, these problems became less common, especially after the early mutinies in AD 14 were dealt with. But in the 6th century, the empire faced wars on many fronts, which stretched its finances thin. This caused payment delays and made soldiers more likely to mutiny again. The final straw in 602, being forced to camp north of the Danube in winter, triggered a major rebellion with long-lasting consequences. Interestingly, throughout both the Republic and late Antiquity, Roman leaders usually gave in to soldiers' demands during mutinies. The 602 mutiny shows what could happen when those in charge refused to listen. This refusal was especially dangerous because the angry soldiers were stationed close to Constantinople, the heart of imperial power. In contrast, other mutinies, like those in North Africa in 536 or along the Rhine, and in Pannonia in AD 14, were farther from the capital and posed less immediate threat to the emperor. Civil war was a major part of Roman history, not just because of how often it happened, but because of how much time, effort, and resources it consumed. Although civil wars were less frequent than wars against foreign enemies, they had a huge impact. In the Republic, most civil wars occurred in the last 50 years, starting with Sulla's conflict with Marius in the 80s BC and ending with Octavian's war against Antony in the 30s. Under the emperors, major civil wars happened in 68 to 69 and again in 193 to 197. There was a long break after the Republic, likely because people wanted to avoid the horrors of civil war. The mid-3rd century saw another wave, followed by smaller outbreaks in the 4th century and a few more in the early 5th century. After that, there was relatively little civil war, especially during the 6th century, except for a few challenges like that of Vitalian against Emperor Anastasius. Civil wars were especially damaging because they often caused very high casualties. While ancient sources might have exaggerated some numbers, battles like Philippi and Cremona clearly resulted in tens of thousands of deaths. In 351, at the Battle of Mursa, both sides reportedly lost more than half their armies, troops that could have been used for defending the empire instead of fighting each other. But the real tragedy of civil war wasn't just the numbers. It was that Romans were fighting against other Romans. This reversed everything their military values were built on. Roman soldiers were used to believing the gods were on their side in battle. But in a civil war, both sides claimed to be loyal Romans and to have divine support. That must have been very unsettling, especially for soldiers who were facing people who spoke the same language, used the same weapons, and followed the same traditions. There's even a sad story from the first Republican civil wars, where a soldier unknowingly killed his own brother in battle and, overwhelmed with grief, took his own life. This became a symbol of how civil war could tear apart families and destroy natural bonds. Julius Caesar also expressed regret about harming fellow citizens. At one point, he chose to starve an enemy army into surrender rather than kill them in battle. And the historian Cassius Dio described the soldiers at the Battle of Pharsalus as hesitant to fight because they knew they were facing people just like themselves. Given all this emotional and moral weight, why did Roman soldiers still take part in civil wars again and again throughout history? That's a question that remains important and complex. But it's clear that even when civil war felt unnatural, political ambition, survival, loyalty to commanders, and the hope of reward were often strong enough to override personal hesitation. Since civil war was something new and shocking in the Roman world at the time, it's not surprising that leaders in the late Republic felt the need to justify it to their soldiers. In 88 BC, Sulla told his troops that he didn't want to use force, but had no choice because his enemies, Marius and Sulpicius, were threatening him, even though he was the legally elected consul. He claimed that they were breaking the rules of the Republic, and more importantly, he said he wanted to free the state from tyranny. This idea of fighting to protect the Republic and restore freedom became a common excuse in Roman civil wars from then on. Similarly, in 49 BC, Caesar justified his march into Italy by saying that he wanted to give power back to the Roman people and stop a small group of elites from taking over. Sulla also tried to strengthen his case by saying he had a dream, something Caesar also claimed later at the Rubicon. And he spread rumors that Marius, if given command of the Eastern campaign against Mithridates, would take all the glory and loot for his own men, leaving Sulla's soldiers with nothing. These tactics didn't convince Sulla's officers, who saw marching on Rome as an attack on their own country, but they did convince the ordinary soldiers, who followed Sulla enthusiastically. This shows how serious and unusual it was at that time to raise arms against fellow Romans. Interestingly, by the time Caesar made a similar move in 49 BC, most of his officers supported him, suggesting that views on civil war had changed significantly over those decades. Later civil wars, especially after Caesar's death, still relied on these types of justifications. Generals knew how fragile army loyalty could be and feared desertion. So during the wars of 44 to 43 BC, Octavian and his allies said they were defending the Republic's libertas from oppression, an idea Octavian would later repeat in his official autobiography, the Res Gestae. In his later conflict with Antony, Octavian also claimed that Antony wanted to move the empire's capital from Rome to Alexandria, which made him look like a traitor to Rome. Alongside these political arguments, the generals also made promises of money to keep their soldiers loyal. For Caesar's veterans, another key reason to stay involved was to protect the land grants they had received from him and make sure those promises were not taken away. In the Civil War of 68 to 69 AD, soldiers were still motivated by the promise of loot. But another big factor was how the enemy was portrayed. For example, Emperor Otho described Vitellius's army as made up of foreigners, Germans and tribes from Gaul and the Rhine. His own soldiers mocked the enemy, calling them outsiders and acting like Italy was being invaded by strangers. This image of the foreign enemy may have been exaggerated by the historian Tacitus, but it also made sense at the time. During the Republic, Roman legions were mostly made up of Italians. But by the 1st century AD, more and more soldiers were coming from far-off provinces of the empire. These men had very different languages, cultures, and traditions. Since legions often recruited from their local areas, it became easier for soldiers from one region to see others as different, even foreign. A famous example is during the Battle of Cremona, when the 3rd Legion cheered the sunrise, probably because they had served in Syria and picked up sun worship customs. These soldiers were legally Roman citizens, but many had never even seen the city of Rome. The idea of what it meant to be Roman had become much more complicated. Another big change was the rise of the Auxilia, non-citizen troops who played a bigger role in the army under Augustus and later. Their presence in the armies of 68 to 69 AD made the enemy look even more foreign, which may explain why soldiers felt less guilt about fighting in a civil war than they had during the Republic. In the Republican period, there was more hesitation. For instance, in 87 BC, there was a famous story about a soldier who unknowingly killed his brother in battle and then took his own life in grief. But in 69 AD, Tacitus tells of a soldier who killed his brother and demanded a reward, showing a much colder attitude. In another case, a son killed his father without knowing it. While he was upset, the other soldiers kept fighting and looting, even against their own kin. They knew it was wrong, but did it anyway. Even so, some generals still tried to use old Republican ideas to justify their actions. When Septimius Severus wanted his troops to help him take power, he told them that Pertinax had been wrongly killed by the Praetorian Guard and that justice had to be served. He also said that the soldiers from Syria who supported his rival, Pescennius Niger, were spoiled by luxury and not real warriors, or even real Romans. On his victory arch in Rome, Severus even used a line that sounded like something from the late Republic, claiming he had restored the Republic. This shows how powerful these old ideas still were, even in a changing empire. The civil wars during the Principate often happened when the last emperor of a dynasty, like Nero or Commodus, lost the support of the powerful senators and didn't leave behind a clear heir. In both cases, the winners ruled long enough to pass power on to their sons and bring some stability. But after the death of Severus Alexander in 235 AD, things didn't settle down quickly. This time, the empire faced major threats from outside, like the rise of the Sasanian Empire in the east and stronger Germanic tribes in the north. These constant military threats caused repeated crises along the borders. In turn, that gave military generals more chances to take power for themselves, leading to political chaos. Sadly, we don't have detailed historical records from the mid-3rd century, so it's hard to know how these generals convinced their troops to fight fellow Romans. More information only becomes available again in the 4th century. One tactic that reappears in this period is branding the other side as foreigners. A good example is from the 350s AD, when the Emperor Constantius II tried to label his rival Magnentius as a barbarian, even though he was really just a regular Roman provincial. The same idea appeared with the rebel Electus, who was said to dress and act like a barbarian. Later, in the early 500s, sources claimed that another rebel, Vitalian, also had barbarian roots, likely part of government propaganda. In the 400s in the Western Empire, many rebels looked for support from barbarian groups already living within the empire. This made it easier for their enemies to call them outsiders. One example of this tactic is the war of Emperor Anastasius against the Isaurians near the end of the 5th century. The Isaurians were seen as mountain bandits and were disliked because their ruler Zeno had been unpopular. Anastasius's victory over them was celebrated because it ended the need to send large payments to their region. There was also another version of the same idea, labeling the enemy not as ethnic outsiders, but as religious outsiders. For example, in 394 AD, Arbogast and his army were described as pagans, fighting against the Christian emperor Theodosius. All these examples show that leaders often tried to make their enemies look like the other to win support in civil wars. In the civil wars of the 4th century, it was very important for each side to claim that they were the rightful rulers, and that their opponents were not. A lot of what we know comes from sources written after the events, but these likely reflect the messages used during the wars to convince soldiers and the public. One common tactic was to call the rival a tyrannus, a term that by then strongly suggested someone who had no legal right to rule. We see this in how Constantine's supporters described Maxentius and Licinius, how Constantius II spoke about Magnentius, and how Theodosius spoke about Magnus Maximus. Another effective strategy was claiming a connection to respected past emperors. Constantine, for example, reminded people he was the son of Constantius I and even claimed descent from Claudius Gothicus. The rebel Procopius also used this tactic by bringing out members of the Constantinian family to prove he was related to them. One important question in civil wars was what happened to the soldiers on the losing side if they survived. Sometimes they were killed, like the Pompeian troops at Thapsus in 46 BC, but that was rare. More often, losing soldiers were either dismissed or reassigned to other duties. For example, many of Caesar's defeated enemies were sent to protect the eastern provinces, and after the Battle of Philippi, 14,000 of Brutus's men joined Antony and Octavian's armies. Soldiers who fought for Vitellius in 69 AD were moved to the Balkans to help defend against invasions, and they continued to serve under Vespasian. A similar pattern appeared in the civil wars of the 4th century, where defeated troops were usually added to the winner's army. In general, Roman leaders were practical. Except for rare cases like Octavian's mass demobilization after Actium to reduce the size and cost of the army, the empire still needed experienced soldiers. So instead of punishing them, leaders often made the troops swear loyalty again and then sent them to serve in a different region. This shows that keeping the empire secure was usually more important than seeking revenge.